For now, you just call that school something like the Fargo Community High School, then revert to your policy about naming school buildings. This would be similar to the NFL's Washington Redskins recently dropping the name Redskins and just being called Washington while they look for another nickname. I acknowledge there has been some difference of opinion on the Woodrow Wilson issue, but nobody has denied Wilson's brutal racism or defended it. Some say, well, Wilson was simply a product of his times. The trouble is, he was not. Wilson used his powers to take racism, hatred, and white supremacy to another level, and that's why the focus is solely on Wilson. When it comes to African Americans, Wilson's policies took away their rights, their hopes, their jobs, their dignity, and often their lives. When Wilson was president of Princeton University, he imposed a new shameful policy in which the university would no longer admit African Americans. Moreover, he also rescinded the admissions of previously admitted African Americans. When Wilson became president of the United States, Black Americans had been working side by side with white Americans for decades. Wilson changed that. He authorized segregation throughout the federal government. African Americans had to work in their own walled-off areas or cages and could no longer eat in the same lunchrooms or use the same bathrooms as their white co-workers. African Americans were no longer to be hired in much of the federal government, while many of them were either demoted or fired. Wilson personally fired dozens of African American workers and replaced them with white people. Encouraged by Wilson's racist policies, white mobs went on the rampage against African Americans. The mobs beat Black Americans, torched or destroyed their businesses, and murdered thousands of innocent African Americans. The victims were beaten, drowned, lynched, or shot to death. African American leaders begged Wilson to speak out against the mob violence. Sadly, Wilson said nothing. In dropping the Woodrow Wilson name, the Princeton University Board of Trustees emphasized that Wilson's appalling record was not just a product of his times. The Princeton University statement said, quote, Wilson's racism was significant and consequential even by the standards of his own time. Wilson's racist thinking and policies make him an inappropriate namesake for a school. Princeton is part of an America that has too often disregarded, ignored, or excused racism, end of quote. Some have asked, what about the rest of Wilson's record? As if the racism alone isn't enough. Well, other parts of Wilson's record are also alarming, such as arresting, imprisoning, and interrogating hundreds of thousands of Americans for exercising their constitutional rights of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. The only other thing I've heard opponents say is, you cannot erase history. That's true. But this is not erasing history. This is acknowledging history. Right now, we are at a very teachable moment. In a district that rightfully honors federal judge Ronald Davies for ordering integration, the horrors Woodrow Wilson inflicted on African Americans cannot be overlooked any longer. I am asking you today to make a strong and powerful statement against bigotry, hatred, white supremacy, and racial violence, and in favor of racial justice, tolerance, and equality for all. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jim. I know we were a little over 4 minutes, but I also know that the comments are important to hear at this time. Barry Nelson.
Good afternoon. We'll save time on mine, so I yield my time to Mr. Shaw. Good afternoon, members of the Fargo School Board, Superintendent Dr. Gandhi. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. My name is Barry Nelson. I live at 902 42nd Avenue North. Although I've had the great privilege of being the immediate past chair of the Fargo Human Relations Commission, which heard the same argument last month, I am here more as a resident of Fargo School District, being the father of alumni from Fargo School District and grandfather of current students within the district. I also had a young woman from South Africa who lived with my family and who is an alumni of Woodrow Wilson High School. My successor in the Fargo Human Relations Mature is here and will bring forth the results of the presentation and our commission. I'm going to speak as a citizen. I would say that I'm probably like 95% of other Fargo residents that 3 to 4 months ago, knew nothing about the racial legacy of Woodrow Wilson. I would also probably think that I'm represent about 95% of Fargo residents when my first response internally was, well, you have to take into account the time and context in which President Wilson was operating, which Mr. Shaw has refuted very well this afternoon. But I did some, at Mr. Shaw's prompting, looking into the legacy. And this person was not a product of his time. He went above and beyond his time to inflict pain and suffering upon Black Americans. He may not have orchestrated the imposition of horrific Jim Crow laws, but he did nothing to suppress it. And the rest, as they say, is history. The only argument, as Mr. Shaw talked about, against removing the name is that by removing the name, just as the argument against removing statues and names commemorating Confederacy leaders and generals, one is removing history. I would count that as so much hooey. Right now I'm reading the book, The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration by Isabel Wilkerson. It is firsthand accounts of the chilling and fatal impact of Jim Crow laws, which precipitated the greatest mass movement of people in this continent. At age 68, I'm learning for the first time an accounting of U.S. history that was never told to me, and maybe I missed school that day and I didn't hear it. So I really urge you to remove this horrific name that does not represent Fargo. It does not represent the United States. And please remove that from the high school. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Faith Dixon.
Good evening. My name is Faith Dixon. I'm one of the leaders of Black Lives Matter here in the Fargo-Moorhead area. I am also coming to you to discuss a much-needed change of Woodrow Wilson Public School. The time is now. His name has been removed from educational institutions all over America, such as Princeton University. They also started this movement and believed we should follow. Wilson's racism was significant and consequential even by the standard of his own time. He segregated the federal civil service after it had been racially integrated for decades, thereby taking America backward in its pursuit of justice. He not only fully accepted, but also added to the persistent practice of racism in this country, a practice that continues to do harm even today. He's used his office to spread his views of hate and racism, and Wilson's segregation policies made him an especially inappropriate namesake for a public policy school, such as Woodrow, here in Fargo. When our city names a school of public policy for a political leader, it suggests that the honoree is a model for students who study at the school. This searing moment in American history has made clear that Wilson's racism disqualifies him from that role. In a nation that continues to struggle with racism, this city and its school of public education must stand clearly and firmly for equality and justice. I advocate for a name change that will reflect the moral values and beliefs of inclusion going forward. We should not sit back quietly in ignorance and allow our students to learn about Woodrow Wilson's atrocities while attending a facility named in his honor. We also believe that Thomas Roosevelt should be removed as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Faith. Mature, Alir.
Thank you, President Rebecca. Thank you, President Gandhi, and thank you all the school board leaders here. I am here on behalf of Fargo Human Relations Commission. I am the current chair. I just took over last month. And on my first day as the chair, I had Mr. Shaw came over and did a presentation. We didn't make the decision right away, but we did follow up. And did our own research and finding us the credible to make that changes happen. I'm here to ask you and stand with all other people of color in your school in making that changes happen. We're not here to erase the history or change the history. We're asking to take away the bad names and start reconciliations as one community, as one body, into making Fargo a better place for all. Thank you.
Thank you. John Rodenbaker.
Good evening, everyone. Fun to be on this side of the podium. I am John Rodenbiker. I live at 1025 9th Avenue South here in Fargo, here as a citizen and a parent of students in the district. President Knutson, board members, Superintendent Gandhi, other members of the administration. On tonight's agenda is school renaming policy considerations. Please use this opportunity to move to begin renaming the Woodrow Wilson High School. Fargo's alternative high school is an excellent program that deserves an excellent name worthy of that school, worthy of its status as a school of choice, and of its objective to be the district's safest, most welcoming, and most accepting school. Frankly, the current name does not meet that standard. It's past time for this name change. Others this evening have laid out the history of Woodrow Wilson, but locally, this issue was first brought to the board's attention by Mr. Shaw 3 years ago. This is not a knee-jerk reaction to current events that are happening in the past week. This is a discussion that could have been happening over past years. At that time, I supported at least the discussion, and tonight I support action now. Now is the time. I recognize that this isn't the only important and urgent matter before the board. Safety of our students and staff must be the number one consideration, of course, and always. Yes, capacity issues threaten the equality of our experiences of our students in our schools. But finding a name that this program deserves can and should be on your agenda and to be addressed now. And so I look forward tonight to the board directing its Communications, Engagement, and Advocacy Committee, newly renamed and refocused, to create a plan and bring a recommendation back to the board to rename Woodrow Wilson High School to something much more appropriate. The plan and the renaming need to be completed this school year before school starts for this program in the 2021-2022 school year. And at a minimum, students, staff, and alumni of the school must be engaged as part of the renaming process. I know we as a community can and will find a new name of someone with local connections, someone reflective of the district's and this school's student diversity, and worthy of being named at this school. Thank you very much this evening for your time and your consideration.
Thank you, John. Ruth Buffalo.
My name is Ruth Buffalo. I'm not going to disclose my address because for safety reasons, as an Indigenous woman who has been targeted for standing up against injustices such as the Woodrow Wilson. I can be reached at P.O. Box 9763. And I'm going to introduce myself to you in the Hidatsa language. Nido shadzao, nachbaga o, madashi mia edasheds, ma be sigids, ma zigidads nachbaga o. I want to say thank you for having us here tonight. Many of us, like you, are taking time away from our families to advocate on behalf of people that we don't even know. I also want to acknowledge the land that we stand on, the land of the Dakota people and the Anishinaabe people. I am a 100th generation North Dakotan. Some might argue that I'm a 1000th generation North Dakotan. I am here to ask you in a good way to please change the name. If we are true to Fargo Public Schools' mission of educating and empowering all students to succeed, then we will change the name. We all have a personal responsibility to not only ourselves, our families, our generations, future generations, and what kind of legacy are we going to leave? We have a personal responsibility to do what we can within our reach. And within our reach, that means today, for you, Honorable School Board, please change the name. Right now, we're celebrating the 100th year anniversary for women's right to vote. Maybe it might be a good idea to look and do a map survey, windshield survey, of what buildings within our communities are honoring women. In my culture, women are held at the highest regard. I come from a matrilineal people, matriarchal people. Women have always been held in high regard. Women are nurturers, we're life givers, and that is the epitome of educating each other and our communities. So I please ask you in a good way to find it in your hearts to change the name. I was called upon by an elder to be here tonight, and within our cultural values and protocols, when someone asks you to do something like show up tonight, you do that in a good way. So Madzigidads, thank you for your time.
Thank you. That concludes everyone that signed up this evening. You're welcome to stay for the rest of our meeting if you'd like, or if you need to take off, feel free to do that too. But thank you so much for joining us. Moving on to staff reports, we have the FEA report, and Jennifer is right there. Okay, welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. I'm Jennifer Master, President of the Fargo Education Association. I'm going to keep this brief because I know you have a long agenda ahead of you, but first of all, thank you for opening up the meeting to the community. As you can see, we have a lot of passionate people who eloquently spoke tonight, and this is an example of what we teach our children in school every single day, is to speak up for areas that they see injustices in. So thank you for opening that up. I would say it's been a really quiet 2 weeks, but we all know that's a lie, that it hasn't been quiet. But with the decision that came out on Monday, I would like to tell you that educators are standing together, united, ready to do the work ahead of them as we open schools for staff on August 24th and for students on September 2nd. I just want you to be aware that I have been receiving many communications regarding staff who are concerned, whether it was distance learning or in-person learning. So as a board, I know you guys have the power to allow for resignations and retirements, and I would encourage you to let those people do that if they feel needed, because I don't want anybody in our classrooms who feel unsafe or in the wrong spot because of this pandemic. I would also encourage maybe allowing sabbatical leaves during this time so that we can keep our highly qualified staff. And as we look to different reports going forward, I see you're doing committees tonight. And as we look at various committees, there's ones that interact with educators a lot more than others. Please make sure you're putting people on there with the mindsets to be collaborative. I think the work that we have done with Dr. Gandhi and Robin Nelson over the last 6 to 7 months needs to continue, so I ask you to make sure you pick community members who represent those same values. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. Dr. Gandhi for a superintendent report.
Thank you, board members, and thank you for everyone that's joining us tonight. I think a lot of our communication the last couple of weeks has been focused on reentry planning, and as President Masters alluded to, on Monday, the FPS Instructional Plan Committee made a decision that for all of our schools, K-12, we will be opening the school year at level 3. So I'm going to say a little bit away from reentry planning, just because we have been communicating some of that information, but just want to let board members and our community members know that there's a plethora of information on COVID-19 that can be found on our Fargo Public Schools website, and we are starting to work on a variety of resources to chunk the information as well. What was first originally an 82-page plan, we do have a couple of summary documents as well that kind of outlines our plan and provides a lot of general FAQ questions for our parents, community members, and our staff as well. I also want to share some exciting news to our board. Horace Mann Roosevelt Elementary School is now officially approved as a Title I school this year, allowing us to use Title I funds to serve all of the students in that school. So that is an application process that we were just notified earlier last week, that was approved. So we are excited about that, and we know that that's going to be able to provide a great deal of resources and support for all of our students at HMR. And that is it for my staff report.
Thank you, Dr. Gandhi. Moving on to the consent agenda, is there a motion for approval? Robin?
I have a question, and I think David does as well.
Yes, go ahead, Robin, and then David.
So, Dr. Gandhi, when Horace Mann is being rated as a Title I school, what does that mean for the partnership or the pairing with Roosevelt?
I'll let Missy start.
I'm sorry, Robin, could you just say that part again?
Sure. So if Horace Mann has been eligible to be called a Title I school, what does that mean for the pairing with Roosevelt?
Oh, the Horace Mann Roosevelt was approved as one unit together.
Thank you.
Yeah.
David?
As most of the school board members have been, I've received a tremendous number of emails, and I just think that the people out there need some clarification. Now, we've gone over all these. We know what level 1 through level 4 are and we're talking about hybrid plan. It's obvious by reading these emails that a lot of those people have no clue what level 3 or a hybrid plan is. I think with the opportunity now to speak to the closed circuit audience, I'd just like Dr. Gandhi to explain what this hybrid plan means K through 12. When are the kids going to be in class and when are they not? Thank you.
Sure. So our hybrid plan K-12 means that students are going to receive a combination of in-person instruction along with distance learning instruction, mainly done online through both synchronous and asynchronous opportunities. So students at the elementary level will be in one of two groups, and those groups will either come to school on Monday, Tuesday, or Thursday, Friday, and then both groups will alternate Wednesdays based on each week. We are planning on notifying all parents and community members of what group students are going to be in this week, so that information is coming out as well. And we are looking at a similar plan for high school as well. I know that when our plan originally was presented to parents and members of the community, our hybrid plan for middle school and high school students started the school year off online. That is not the case. That was one of the revisions that we had made and discussed when we presented the plan to the board work session. So the school year will be starting with a combination of face-to-face and online instruction for students that are grouped both all across the system, kindergarten through 12th grade.
Does that help, David?
One more question. At the last board meeting, it was said at that time it was going to be Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday for one group, and Thursday and Friday, and then there would be guided practice at the high schools on off days. Is guided practice still a part of this plan?
So when we had worked in, the Guided Practice Center was a value added that we were able to provide that set of services when we were going to start the school year with all the secondary students online. What we said in our plan originally was that, and the way our plan states right now, is that because we're starting on face-to-face instruction for our middle school and high school students, we wouldn't be able to provide guided practice at the earliest until October 5th. However, that can also change because the committee is going to meet every 2 weeks. So if the committee were to decide that elementary students are at level 4 and secondary students could then continue at the hybrid model, so Guided Practice Center could begin in October, but it's going to be based on which instructional plan that we're in. So starting September 2nd, no, there will not be any Guided Practice Center.
I promise this is the last question. The last numbers I saw for the virtual learning were around 700. What I know that enrollment has now ceased. What is the final number for the number of students that signed up for virtual learning?
When I saw it earlier today, they were in the 1,230 range, and it could have changed a little bit here or there, but that's to my recollection as of today.
Dr. Gross is nodding yes. At least it's close.
Yes, it just all depends on which time of day we look. Last time I looked, it was at 12:41, so very close.
All right, thank you for that additional information, and thanks for the questions. Is there a motion for approval of the consent agenda? Jim?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
There's a motion and a second for approval of the consent agenda. Everyone in favor signify by saying yes.
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 Opposed? Motion passes. On to business. Just a reminder that we are moving, we have item C under business, and it's contract for busing services memo 20. Right now, we will go to item A, the 2020-21 committee and liaison assignments. It's memo 22. And is there a motion for approval? Jim?
Yeah, I'd like to move that we approve the committee and liaison partnership assignments as presented in memo number 22 in our board packet.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, is there any discussion on this? Any discussion at all? All right, Anne Marie, would you please call the roll?
Benson.
Yes.
Gullickson. Holden.
Yes.
Johnson.
Yes.
Robin Nelson.
Yes.
Newman.
Yes.
Paulson.
Yes.
President Knudsen.
Yes, motion passes. Item B, school renaming policy considerations, memo 23. There is information, we all have information here. It's a memo that comes from me. It is, it kind of culminates a lot of the discussion actually that happened earlier today from the guests that joined us. And supplementing the memo is a letter that is from the chair of the Fargo Human Relations Commission. It's the letter dated July 20th when that commission took action to vote to encourage the school board to change the name of Woodrow Wilson High School. There is also an article on the back side of that that was an opinion written by Jim Shaw. And then we have our AP 3260 policy regarding titled naming of facilities included. So I would like to turn this over to fellow board members for discussion. Robin?
President Knudsen, I would like to make a motion to direct the newly appointed Community Engagement and Advocacy Committee to add to their annual work plan a community engagement exercise to consider the school naming policy and also consider a renaming process of current buildings.
Is there a second to that motion?
Second.
Tracy made the second? Okay, thank you. Is there any discussion? Rupak, I know we talked earlier. You mentioned that you would have a couple of items you'd like to say, but so if you'd like to go ahead, and then we can have some additional discussion afterwards if need be.
Sure. So I think I just want to start with a question in terms of process. So the motion, just for my clarity, is to direct the board's community engagement and advocacy team to work towards redoing the administrative policy on school naming procedures.
I don't think redoing is probably the right term, but analyzing it and also strongly considering a renaming building process as well.
So would we, okay, so I think just for clarity, so would we be looking at adding renaming standards or a process for adding renaming to the AP that's in the board packet, or would that be an EL policy that we would come up with as a board, just for process?
Great question. I would leave that, my intention was to analyze the AP, the administrative policy, but leave it up to that committee if they need to widen their scope.
And under our executive limitations policy 10, which is communication and counsel to the board, the policy point 14 points out, in essence, an effort of collaboration and information and informing board members of changes regarding administrative policies. So I guess I would see it as that's a little vague, but it's open for discussion in terms of what that involvement and discussion with then that board committee would be. I would see that it would be up to that board committee and administration to work hand in hand to identify what that process is. Does that make sense?
Complete.
Another question that I have, well, first of all, Anne Marie, could you please read the motion again?
Robin, did you have it written down?
I did, but last minute. Would you like me to restate it?
That'd be great.
And then you can correct my grammar in print, please. I move to direct the newly appointed Community Engagement and Advocacy Committee to add to their annual work plan a community engagement exercise to consider the school naming policy and to include a renaming process consideration.
I have a question. Anne Marie, is it okay if I talk while you're typing? Okay. Robin, how do you see this in connection to the request this evening and the discussion about renaming Woodrow Wilson?
I personally am not comfortable dropping the name as a board without extensive community engagement. And to Mr. Rodenbiker's point, I would like to have, in particular, alumni and current students of that educational facility involved.
Jim?
Rupak, I don't want to assume anything. Obviously, we're talking about an AP policy, which concerns me when the board starts to want to rewrite administrative policies. Do you have concerns that we are abridging the governance gap with this motion?
I think if we narrow the scope in terms of what we're asking here and we keep it to that scope, then it can fall under our governance structure, because we do have an EL policy that says the board will be considered on AP policies that are controversial, and I would assume that school naming facilities is one of those and that we collaborate. So as long as we're respectful of our governance structure and we have clear direction in what is expected, I would feel comfortable with that, but let's stay to that scope of work.
Jim?
With that indication from you, then, I kind of support this policy for a couple of, or this motion for a couple of reasons. I too, much like many people in the audience, do not necessarily consider Woodrow Wilson somebody that we should be holding out as a role model, certainly not for our students. So renaming the building may be the right thing to do, but I have concerns if we do it without policy being in place. We have several buildings that other people in our community could take exception to. In fact, one of the speakers mentioned one of them, Roosevelt. But clearly Washington, Madison, Lewis and Clark, Ben Franklin, Jefferson, and Kennedy all could have people that, for whatever reasons, feel it's not an appropriate name. And I understand all of these people were also, or many of these people were also elected president of this great country in their time frame. So I think having a policy is critical, and I think having it front and center so we get a decision made still this school year, get the input from our community, as well as our internal community of students and staff at Woodrow. I'm supportive of this idea.
Robin?
Thank you for correcting that, Jim. I do agree this is more of a board-level policy, and I assume that the new communications, we need an acronym for this, will proceed accordingly.
Seth?
I agree that we definitely need policy because, as Jim says, there's many schools that could come up in this. But as both Jim Shaw and former member Rodenbiker stated, this has been a 3-year thing, so I'm wondering how fast this particular school would move along if this motion were to pass.
Robin?
I would say the charge would be for the currently appointed committee and for their work plan, so that that motion assumes that work would be complete before that committee, before our next reorganizational meeting.
Seth?
Sorry. Would we be able to have this, if we did move forward with changing this name through that committee, would we be able to accomplish that before the 2021-2022 school year? or not?
I don't see why not. I'm just going to share my point right now. I don't see why not. It's a newly formed committee. I guess we'd have to get into the meats and the bones of it, and we have to have a motion that's approved in order to do it. But that's a newly formed committee. As far as I'm concerned, that could be the first item that committee addresses, unless there's something else that's more pressing. Personally, myself, I want the folks to know here today that I have enough information myself to know that Woodrow Wilson should be not the name of that building. If there is any other interest of other board members, that shares that, that's fine. But I do want the community to know that I feel like I have the information that I would need if I were asked to be having a name change. I also support, however, this policy work. Any other comments? Nikki?
President Knutson, I feel the same way that you do, that I have enough information to support that change. My question is, could we do something in the interim while we're working on all of this to remove at least that piece? Could we do an interim name, such as just Fargo High, or I know we used to have a Fargo Central High. Could we utilize that name?
So I do want to make sure that we are continuing discussion regarding the motion that was made, which was specifically regarding the policy. And if there is other discussion that is in relation to the policy and that motion that was made, and Anne Marie could read, do you want to reread that, Anne Marie, for us, please?
I'd be happy to. The motion on the floor is to direct the newly appointed Communications Engagement and Advocacy Committee to add to their annual work plan a community engagement exercise to consider the school naming policy and include a school renaming process consideration.
So if there is any other discussion specifically regarding to that motion, we could have it. And then if there's not, we can vote on it. And if there's any other action that the board would like to take, the board is free to do that. Rupak?
I apologize, but I think for the first time, I'm going to suggest directive to the board. And this, what I'm going to say is I appreciate the motion says it would be in the communication engagement team board committee's work plan, annual work plan. I would think that maybe that consideration, the board make that a time-sensitive consideration where the policy is back prior to the start of the school year, because I think we have a responsibility as a school district, and based on even the conversation that we're hearing today, to make sure that we are showing that we do not tolerate racism and we do not tolerate prejudice. And if we want to do that, instead of just keep saying, okay, let's have a year to develop the policy, and then we'll vote on the policy, then we won't invoke the policy until possibly the following school year for a name change. This is a conversation that's happening now, and if the position is that we need to be able to have that conversation now, but we don't have standards for that name change, let's get that done quicker, so then we can get the work that we want to get done and have that change this school year prior to the start of next. That would just be a suggestion from me.
I would agree with your statement. Thank you, Rupak, for sharing that. Any other comments or questions? All right.
President
Robin?
Knutson, I would guess that, and I don't know how to amend this because I don't know what kind of time window this committee needs on top of all of the extra work that the communications department is in the midst of right now. So I would be happy to listen to an amendment to this motion that includes a time certain date if somebody feels so inclined and confident in that committee's ability.
Nikki?
Thank you. That very point was the reason I was asking if we could do something interim so we could have a little time to properly assemble appropriate policies, so we could all meet, so we could collaborate, so we had a little bit of time. But I do think it's pressing and it's urgent to respond fairly quickly, especially with this particular one. So I apologize if it was a little bit out of the right order, but that was my thinking behind the question.
Well, I would share that action ought to be taken immediately, that the work needs to start immediately. And if that's tonight or if that's tomorrow, but as soon as possible, I would say that the communications, that committee, Nikki, that you're chair of, and the others of us that are on that, but that a meeting needs to take place, a request for a meeting needs to take place immediately. visiting with Dr. Gandhi to figure out what the steps would be to be moving forward on that, and that we don't wait a moment. Seth?
Could I add an amendment to this motion? Could I move that the board remove the name Woodrow Wilson and use Fargo Community High School until the Communication Engagement Advocacy Committee can come up with a more appropriate name?
Robin?
Yes, but it would need a second, I assume.
Point of order.
Yes, Anne Marie?
An amendment needs to insert or remove words from a motion. And unless you specifically tell me what words you'd like to remove or insert, that would need to be directed for the amendment of the motion.
Do you need the motion to be read again so that you could figure out where you would like to insert language, Seth? Excuse me, Jim? Oh,
Maybe, Seth, you want to let us vote on this thing and then bring that motion back, because we're not limited to just
If I can do that, I would be-
action item on this agenda item.
Absolutely. I would be comfortable with.
and that's what I was trying to say, is that we can take action on this motion, and if there are other motions that the board wants to bring up, that would be fine. Jennifer?
So I have a question. Is administration planning a public forum in November, as we have in previous years? Perhaps just as a suggestion when we're searching for a timeline or an opportunity to engage the public. What are your thoughts on that?
The state of the schools?
Yeah.
As of right now, we haven't, I'll leave to Anne Marie, but that's a large group event, which we're not doing for at all. We're not even doing back to school nights right now, but.
We have a tentative date for one. We have moved that to January. We've moved that back a little bit, so we have a tentative date that we've held this location actually, but we haven't started to announce that yet. But so we're looking at a January timeframe for that.
Thank you.
I feel we're ready to vote. Anne Marie?
Gullickson?
Yes.
Holden?
Yes.
Johnson?
Yes.
Robin? Nelson?
Yes.
Newman?
Yes.
Paulson?
Yes.
Benson?
Yes.
Knutson?
Yes. Motion passes. Is there any other business that's in relation to this agenda item? Seth?
I move the board remove the name Woodrow Wilson High School and use Fargo Community High School until the Communications, Engagement, and Advocacy Committee can come up with a more appropriate name for the 2021-2022 school year.
There's been a motion. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Okay. Motion by Seth, seconded by Nikki. Jim?
Seth, I'm not against your motion, but I am going to vote against it because I can't remove this name until we actually talk to the students that are currently in that building, the staff that's currently in the building, because quite frankly, they feel it's their high school. It is their identity. Maybe it's one they don't want, but I would prefer we at least engage with the Woodrow Wilson community, if not the broader community, before we just remove it. I have actually heard from people that graduated from the school to not change it. I've also heard from people that graduated from the school to change it. So I don't want to assume I know what those students that are currently planning on being there this fall think should happen with the name of their high school. So I'm not against your motion, but I just can't support it because we haven't engaged that community yet.
David?
Seth, like Jim, I too am not supporting this, and I'm not against the change. I just have heard various people who are for and against it, and I'd like this thoroughly vetted. I'd like the community to get a chance to voice their opinions, so I won't be supporting this either.
Robin?
I would also like to explain my opposition to this motion. I don't think I need to restate what Jim and David had said, but they took the words out of my mouth, so I appreciate the conversation regardless.
Rupak?
And I just want to clarify the previous motion and scope of work, going back to that. It is my understanding that the Communication and Engagement Committee was just tasked to come up with standards or considerations for renaming school policies. There's already a process that we have in policy for naming a new building. So that committee's job would not be to find the new name for Woodrow Wilson. The board already has, we already have a policy for that. So if Woodrow Wilson to drop a name, we have a separate policy that says how do you pick another building's name. But I believe that that's not what the committee, the previous motion charged the board's committee to do. I believe that that motion was come up with the standards for when we would consider renaming schools. So I just want to make sure that we're clear in terms of what that scope of work is or what's being asked of us, so we have clear direction too.
I have comments that I would like to make, but are there any other comments? Nikki.
With all due respect, I do understand and appreciate your guys' position. I really do. I have not heard people that want to keep the name. And because of that, I guess my swift action to at least remove the painful piece of this is why I am supporting this motion, because at least we can show we are making progress. We are taking steps forward. We want to be thoughtful with the way that we do this as we recreate and collaborate on creating new policies and renaming policies. But I feel that by doing this, we can say we are responding and we are taking some action, and more action will be coming forth. And I don't know, maybe it's just personal opinion, I guess I'll just share that, but I would think that there would be some comfort in that, and knowing that there will be collaboration and many parties at the table to be able to work on that and to heal going forward. If this is inflammatory and this is concerning, I'm not sure we should wait.
Any other comments? I'll be supporting the motion. Like I said before, I have the information that I need, that this is a name that needs to change. We have many examples from across the nation that changes are already being made to buildings or to facilities, schools. We have dialogue within our community, as evidenced here tonight, as evidence that has happened all across our community since George Floyd was murdered. And I'm confident that this is a name that needs to change, and I will support whatever decision the board makes. I believe that if we don't make that decision this evening, that does not mean that it's a discussion that's not going to happen. I see that there is still room for that dialogue to happen because of the AP policy that was, the motion that was made before that the board approved. But I will be supporting the motion. Any other dialogue? Tracy.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm just so quiet because there is just no dialogue for me. I will support this motion as well. I think that the public has had, as was stated, 3 years to state their opinions and state how they feel. There's more than enough evidence. I have not heard from constituents who feel the need to keep this name. It's been an overwhelming response the other way. And I agree with your sentiments, Rebecca. There's just enough evidence out there, and cities in our nation have done this. I too, really was a little uninformed about this up until about 3 or 4 months ago when it was being brought forth locally here in Fargo, and I've really enjoyed the process of learning about it. I had never really thought about Woodrow Wilson or been taught, growing up, but I think I sent a video to the board to view that I watched. It was a panel of experts from Princeton University, really from both sides, from all angles, reviewing his legacy, and I learned a lot, and I enjoyed that process. But it's just not a question for me, and I believe the urgency is here to change it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Rubach?
So I just have a question on the second part of the motion, not the dropping the Woodrow Wilson name. I think the second part of the motion said, until the board's community engagement and advocacy team comes up with a new name. So if this motion passes, is the direction for that board's committee to also come up with a new name and forego the process we already have for naming a facility? Because I think there's two pieces to the motion as I heard Seth say it unless I heard it wrong. What I heard was drop the Woodrow Wilson name until the community engagement and advocacy team come up with a new name. And I think that's where that would forego a process we already have for coming up with a new name. So I just want to clarify that.
Yeah, the motion, I move that we remove the Woodrow Wilson name and use Fargo Community High School in the interim before that committee can come up with a permanent, more appropriate name.
So
Sorry, does that answer your question?
I think what I'm saying is, right now, it's not that committee's job to come up with a name for naming the facility. So if the intention is just to drop the Woodrow Wilson name, I think that motion can stop there. But what I'm saying is that we already have a policy that engages the full board, and there's a process for coming up with naming a new facility that involves community input and things of that nature. So we probably don't want to limit that to the responsibility of the board's committee is what I'm saying.
Yeah, then we can drop the second part of the motion, that's fine, yeah.
Anne Marie, would you please read the motion?
What I have down as the motion, and Seth can correct me, is that the board remove the name Woodrow Wilson and call the school Fargo Community High School until the Communications Engagement and Advocacy Committee creates a policy and rename the school by the 2021-22 school year, which I may have missed a few words in that motion.
So based on our discussion here, we've talked that second part of the motion might not be necessary. So, but we've made that motion, we've had a second on that motion, we've had discussion on that language. So if there's an opportunity for him to strike language, Anne Marie, is that appropriate?
It would need to come in the form of an amendment.
Okay, I would like to amend my first motion by removing until the Communications Engagement and Advocacy Committee can come up with a more appropriate name for the 2021-2022 school year.
Seth, could you read what your motion would be then, please?
So then the full motion, including the amendment, would just be I move the board to drop the Woodrow Wilson High School name and use Fargo Community High School.
Okay, so he's made a motion to amend his amendment, right?
Yes.
Or amend the motion. Is there a second to that?
Second.
Is the concern that we're trying to rename this on the spot? No? Okay.
No, it's just that that committee doesn't have the responsibility of naming. Anne Marie had her hand up and Robin seconded.
I would have a question on the amendment so that we'd have it right. Do you want to end the motion with, remove the name Woodrow Wilson High School and call the school Fargo Community High School, period? Or are we still having information in the motion about a renaming process? Because if we're, depending on where we cut it off, we would possibly be renaming the school tonight.
Jennifer?
Can I ask a clarifying question, though, Anne Marie? Even if he cuts it off there, it doesn't change the other motion, correct?
The first motion about the communication, no, that passed, yep.
So he could leave it there, essentially. Is that what you're clarifying?
I want to clarify what we're all removing. So to find out if we are fully renaming the school tonight. Depending on where you put that period, I feel as though you would be potentially renaming the school tonight.
And Seth, I know that you had included language that said something about until a name is developed, or so it was kind of an interim name. And
Yeah.
so depending upon, like Anne Marie said, where you end it, it could be that we're deciding like a formal name of the meeting tonight, but that
is not my
that
intention.
might not be your intention.
No, my intention is that Fargo Community High School is an interim name, temporary, until through policy, the administration can come up with a name.
Robin?
So I guess I need some clarification, too. So your motion, if it were amended, would rename the Woodrow Wilson School indefinitely. And so, unless you add more words back into there with some type of time frame, that the name would remain, And what I'm envisioning is if this committee has this in their work plan, they may very well come up with a renaming process that will help vet the names of current schools. And that could include Woodrow and Washington and every other school and Roosevelt that we're concerned with, but it could not. So that committee might come up with a vetting process that does not change the name of Woodrow Wilson. Not that I'm supporting that, because I'm not a fan of the name, but process is so important, because if you don't have process in place, you make immediate decisions that are hard to, you're setting precedent for future discussion, I guess, is what I have learned in my years on the board.
Any other discussion? Seth? Anne Marie?
I just need to ensure that I'm noting this correctly. Are we stopping, is the amendment to stop the motion after and call the school Fargo Community High School, period? Was that the amendment?
So if that would be the language, I would have to vote against that, because that's an affirmative decision this evening that doesn't allow flexibility for the work that we talked about that's going to be happening as a result of this motion, and it doesn't allow that policy work to take place. So there would have to be different language for me to approve it as Anne Marie read it. Nikki and Rupak?
But Rebecca, before we keep going, can I get a clarification on what the amendment actually is? Because that's part of this discussion too. I do not have clarification on what the amendment is for your minutes. Robin seconded, of course, but can we confirm what the amendment is?
Yes, and Seth, since you made that amendment, could you please read what that would be?
So my amendment, I guess, what my main goal is, I want us to leave here tonight with Woodrow Wilson not being the name of this school, and to allow the process for the motion that we just passed, that Robin had brought forward, to go through and rename the school, so that we leave here, it's not Woodrow Wilson, but that process can take place so that we can come up with a new name but before the 2021-2022 school year.
So that's not
is
the
my
language,
goal.
but that's not the language that we have in front of us right now. So we need to figure out how to.
How to get the language correct, yes.
Yes. Rupak, you had a comment, and then Jennifer.
We have to figure out this amendment piece, because then my comment wouldn't be germane to the motion.
I need to know what language we're striking or adding, please, before we would continue to comment on process. We need to know what the motion on the floor is.
Robin?
So process-wise, I seconded a motion that put a period after renaming the name. That amendment can be withdrawn and restated somehow else.
It cannot be withdrawn, because
it can be defeated.
Correct, thank
Sorry.
you.
We could vote on it and start over if we want to.
That seems easier.
Is there any other discussion?
Yes.
Jennifer?
Can I move to amend it again?
While we can amend an amendment, I don't think anybody is clear on what the amendment is.
So can he just, because he stated his intent for the amendment, can we just help him word that by suggesting that he add that this is temporary until the committee can do their work?
So this is getting kind of messy and dicey, and a vote on this, I think, is going to be the best way for us to move forward. The result of the vote might not showcase exactly what we're trying to do here this evening. I just want to let people know that, but I think what I feel need to do is vote on this so that we can start anew, because I don't believe that, I believe it needs to be reworded. Seth, I don't think you're, getting where you want to be.
Correct.
And I'd like for you to be able to get to that point. So if there's no other discussion, let's have Anne Marie call the roll. on this current motion. And Anne Marie, could you please read what we are voting on?
What my understanding is that the amendment was to remove all of the language after community high school and make a period right there. That is what Robin seconded? Okay. So we ready to vote on that amendment? Yes. Holden?
No.
Johnson?
No.
Nelson?
No.
Newman?
No.
Paulson?
No.
Benson?
No.
Gullickson?
No.
Knutson? No. The amendment fails. Now we're back to an original motion. And Anne Marie, that original motion read,
That the board remove the name Woodrow Wilson High School and call the school Fargo Community High School until the Communications Engagement and Advocacy Committee creates a policy and rename the school by the 2021-22 school year. That's what I had down.
Rubach.
So I think I'm going to try my best to kind of simplify what's happening, and I think it's germane to all aspects of this motion, I believe. So I think there's three things at hand. I think one is, in the motion prior to this, what was the Communications Engagement Committee asked to do? It is my understanding that they were asked to create standards for consideration of school renaming. Then the second piece is what I'm hearing in conversation, and based on this motion, there's a second action item, which is just to drop the name Woodrow Wilson. And then there's a third action item on what name to use, both short-term and long-term. And I think when we mix all three of them together, that's kind of what's led to some of the confusion, because we currently have an administrative policy on how we go about naming new school facilities. And I think my question was, would we invoke that same policy to, if Woodrow Wilson no longer was called Woodrow Wilson, would we want to invoke that same policy and process for renaming the school versus just giving that responsibility to a committee? Because I think the scope of work that was defined in the previous motion to the committee was just to create the standards for renaming it. So I think that's kind of just in my process orientation is where I was trying to see what is it that we want to do as a board. Do we have a committee that's going to work on standards or school name renaming considerations? Now, the board needs to decide, do they want to drop the name Woodrow Wilson? And then if so, then there's a third piece of action which needs to be separated, which is what is the process for naming that school short-term and long-term.
Seth.
Okay, I think I got it. I move the board remove the name Woodrow, sorry.
Anne Marie, so we have a motion on the table, right? So
I still have the original motion.
you would be making an amendment to that
Correct.
motion.
Okay, so I am amending my original motion to strike until the Communications, Engagement, and Advocacy Committee can come up with a more appropriate name for the 2021-2022 school year, and amend that with until administration can come up with a more appropriate name for the 2021-2022 school year based on the standards set forth by the Communications, Engagement, and Advocacy Committee. It's really long, but
Yeah, it is. Is there a second to that? If there's a second, we'll have discussion. If there's no second, then...
Second.
Okay, there's a second? Jennifer? Yes. Okay. Any discussion? Jim?
Again, Seth, I got to vote no on this because you just took away our authority and gave it to the superintendent. The superintendent does not get to name facilities. We have an AP policy that he has to administer, but that ultimate decision on the name of a facility under this policy rests with the board. And your motion, I think, just gave that away to the superintendent. So I'm going to have to vote against it.
Nikki?
I have a question. Can we just do something as simple as tonight as a board to remove the name of Woodrow Wilson and just stop it there?
That's discussion now, that's part of this motion. if that's something that you wanted to do, and the motion is the current language that it is, then you'd have to decide how you're going to be voting on that motion if that was your only intent. Seth?
According to Jim's comments, I would like to add an amendment to my amendment that says until, that inserts the language until administration can recommend to the board a more appropriate name.
Robin, I feel like I'm going to need help soon.
Could you repeat that, please, for me, Seth? You want to insert,
I want to insert after until administration, insert can recommend to the board, and then a more appropriate name for the 2021.
so you're removing and inserting words. You're removing can come up with a more appropriate name for the 2025 school year.
Yes, and
You're
adding-
moving can come up with appropriate name and inserting can recommend to the board a more appropriate name.
Correct.
Is it okay that he is doing this, Anne Marie? Are we within?
You can
I feel
amend
like
an
we're
amend-
getting.
You can amend an amendment, but this is as far as you can go. There's no tertiary amendment. There's the secondary amendment, but nothing further.
Okay. And I don't know if everyone understands the current language that we're talking about. So that would need to be
There needs to
read.
be a second.
Jennifer had seconded.
I didn't hear anybody second the amendment to the amendment.
Okay. Oh, great. Jennifer? Robin?
I completely respect the intent, and I'm just not quite sure the best way to go about this. But I would say that dropping the name now is assuming that the committee the committee will come up with a process that forces the name change of Woodrow Wilson. And that usurps the committee's work and the original, the intent of the original motion. So if we could somehow separate this conversation, I can't vote for that because that is not allowing for community input and for the work of that committee. But I do respect your intent and I don't disagree with your motive.
Any other discussion? So we've had a couple of amendments that we would be, well, we need to vote on the most recent amendment to the amendment.
You'd first be voting on the amendment to the amendment, so you would be voting to clarify his amendment.
Correct.
Johnson?
Did you call roll? Okay.
Johnson? Are we ready to call the roll? I'm sorry.
I believe we're ready to call roll.
On the amendment to the amendment.
No.
Nelson?
No.
Newman?
Can we just I'm so sorry. Can we clarify what we're voting on?
You are voting on removing the words from the amendment can come up with a and inserting the words can recommend to the board.
Yes.
Paulson?
No.
Benson?
Yes.
Gullickson?
Yes.
Holden?
Yes.
Knutson?
Yes. I believe that passes.
5-3.
Now we are on to, Anne Marie, could you help us with language?
Okay, give me just a second. Now you're talking about amending the motion. You're talking about amending the motion to remove everything after community high school and inserting the words, I have to follow along, until administration can recommend to the board a more appropriate name for the 2021 2021-22 school year based upon the standards set by the Communications, Engagement, and Advocacy Committee.
Are there discussion? Is there a discussion or are there questions on this amendment? Robin?
I just guess I need clarification on, do our policies line up? The administration would make a recommendation to the board?
No.
Change.
There's a community engagement process that includes the board. So that's in your packet for how that process works. It's not up to the administration.
Thank you.
Any other discussion?
So
Jennifer?
could you read exactly before we vote? I know that's an amendment, but how it would actually play out? If you could read how it would be inserted?
Sure, you're voting to amend the original motion, and the amendment is to strike until the Communications, Engagement, and Advocacy Committee creates a policy and rename the school by the 2021-22 school year, okay? And inserting until administration can recommend to the board a more appropriate name for the 2021-22 school year based upon the standards set by the Communications, Engagement, and Advocacy Committee.
David?
So I'm thoroughly confused by this. If we vote yes, are we removing AP 3260 that refers to the naming of facilities and the process? Because it clearly states that there's much more involved here than the administration. It involves the community, staff, students, everything. And now we're saying that it's going to be a recommendation of the superintendent, of the administration, excuse me. So that seems like AP 3260 does not exist anymore.
Or that we're not utilizing it in the appropriate manner. I think that was part of your question, Robin, right, that Anne Marie clarified? Go ahead, Robin.
So I would, just a suggestion, and just a friendly one, if we were to approve the original motion without the amendments, we could have some closure on that discussion and assign the committee to have the discussion. And then after that is approved or defeated, an additional motion can come to the floor to remove the name or rename the school. But if you don't want the committee to embark on this conversation, I fear that we would be eliminating that just for the sake of not supporting the amendment. And I'd really like this committee to look at a comprehensive naming and renaming policy. And they may determine they don't want a renaming policy, but we are making assumptions for the committee before they even start their work. So I would be more comfortable, well, with my original motion, to assign the committee to do the work. And then a separate freestanding motion could come to the floor just to ease this conversation because it's pretty painful. Not that I don't support it, but it's painful, the process itself.
Jennifer?
Just for clarification, typically though, in a business item, when we make a motion, it sort of ends discussion, or once we vote on it. So would he then, I mean, clearly the intent is he wants to make another, a motion, but can we, for future practice, how does that normally?
Similar to how the motion came to the floor that we are discussing, going through that process now, a motion, something else can be made. If there's more business that the board wants to do pertaining to this memo, that can be done. So right now, we don't have a motion in front of us, though we have an amendment still, right? Correct. Is there any discussion on the amendment? I feel as if, although I don't, it won't sound right, but I feel like I'm going to have to vote no on it because I feel like the process isn't, I feel like the process is pretty muddy, and I think that it's probably not representative of what I feel the motion, the main intent of the motion is. My feeling on the main intent of the motion is that the name of the school not be used. So I will need to vote against this amendment for that reason, wanting to explain it. Jennifer?
Okay, so I think, though, the amendment does not change the policy because the policy states basically it's an administrative policy. The amendment, along with the original motion, allows for the committee to do its work. And I believe the intent or what the amendment or how it reads would basically just allow administration for that to still exist, for them to say, okay, it's the recommendation of the board that this be considered in any sort of change, correct? Correct me if I'm wrong, Anne Marie, but that's how I'm reading it. I think it just gives it back because it took it away before, and it is an administrative policy. So it allows the process to happen as intended in the original motion and gives a temporary name to the building, just in a long roundabout way.
Rupak?
I think what the intent is, and I don't want to make assumptions, but I think from what I'm hearing, is the intent of the motion is to drop the name and then and use maybe a temporary name if that's the suggestion, until what's the process outlined in AP 3260 for new naming facilities can be utilized for the former school Woodrow Wilson, if that's the name that gets passed.
That is absolutely correct.
So again, that's not the language that's on the in the amendment, and so if there is going to be additional conversation on this, we'd have to vote on the amendment so that we can get through it. Robin?
So I will say, I, again, completely support the spirit of the amendment, but basically what this motion does, it indefinitely renames the school unless the communication or this new committee comes up with a process to not do that. So it's really kind of, again, usurping that work of the committee. So I would be more comfortable supporting a clearer motion and then separating the current name. This is process versus name, and I'd like to support the process, and I'd like to discuss more freely the current name of the school.
Any other discussion? Jennifer?
So I would just say that I think that this does actually, allow the process to happen with an interim name, because ultimately, correct me if I'm wrong, administration could come back and say, based on this process and community input that we did, we would recommend it stays the same, correct?
Seth?
In other words, it doesn't change it indefinitely, the way that it's worded. I'm just trying to clarify.
Right now, you're talking about an amendment to a motion, and the amendment is to strike from the motion to strike part of the motion, right, and add in until administration can recommend to the board a more appropriate name for the 2021-22 school year based on the standards set by the Communications, Engagement, and Advocacy Committee. That is what you're talking about right now.
Seth?
I'm going to be voting no against this amendment and my original motion so that we can move on from this painful monster that I've created and come up with a more simple language that we can vote on.
David?
Can the maker of the motion ask the motion to be withdrawn?
Once a motion is made and seconded, it is of the body, and the body needs to decide what to do with it.
All right. Are we ready to vote on that amendment? Yes. Anne Marie, please call the roll.
Nelson?
No.
Newman?
No.
Paulson?
No.
Benson?
No.
Gullickson?
No.
Holden?
No.
Johnson?
No.
Knutson?
No. The amendment fails. We are back to the original motion. And the original motion, Anne Marie, could you please read that for us?
That the board remove the name Woodrow Wilson High School and call the school Fargo Community High School until the Communications, Engagement, and Advocacy, if Advocacy Committee creates a policy and rename the school by the 2021-22 school year.
Is there any other discussion? All right, Anne Marie, please call the roll.
Nelson.
No.
Newman.
No.
Paulson.
No.
Benson.
Yes.
Gullickson.
No.
Holden.
No.
Johnson.
No.
Knutson.
No. Motion fails. Is there any other business pertaining to the memo in front of us regarding memo number 23? Seth?
I move that the school board immediately immediately remove the name Woodrow Wilson from its high school.
Is there a second to that motion?
I'll second it.
All right, motion by Seth, seconded by Nikki. Robin?
Just a question. So did we approve the original motion to send this to the committee?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
That happened quite a while ago. It's hard to remember. Okay, any other discussion? Jim?
Again, I understand everybody's motivation here, and I don't disagree with any of it, but I also think we're just running too fast and not thinking through, and at least not listening to the community that we're directly impacting. I believe we can't just remove the name of a program, and let's be clear here, there is no Woodrow Wilson building in our district any longer. There's a Woodrow Wilson High School, which is housed in the Agassi building. So we're talking about naming a program. My question is for Dr. Bob, can we have an unnamed high school and have it actually qualify as a high school under North Dakota statute?
I think if I interpret the statute correctly, we would just need to have a plant number, which we still would have for this high school. The name then would need to be changed. So if it is community high school or whatever would be part of that motion, but we would need the plant number for all of the correspondence with the Department of Public Instruction.
Dr. Gross, are you saying the plant number would be need to be included, that information would need to be included along with this? No. Okay.
No, I don't believe that plant number would change at all. It would just be what would be associated with that plant number with the Department of Public Instruction.
Got it, thank you. Any other discussion? Tracy?
I'm just wanting to understand or clarify with Jim's point. So as I'm reading AP 3260, which is our naming of facilities policy, it states the Board of Education, with assistance from administration, will solicit proposed names from the community. So if we are to remove this name tonight and then we just follow what's our AP 3260, we would be involving the community. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes. Any other discussion? Anne Marie?
I just want to bring up some logistical communications issues for you, just for your mind. No opinion about setting aside the reasoning you're having this conversation. We start school in a few weeks, and all of our communication and things we do are based on a school name. And so we would have to very quickly figure out how to, and I'm not saying we can't, I just want you to consider, because this motion on the floor too does not rename the school at all. And so emails go out from the school under a name. People work for a certain school with a name. We have websites that have a name. And so not that it can't be done, but there's many things that would have to occur very quickly. I mean, I don't know if there's emails set to go out from Woodrow to families tomorrow. I mean, I just don't know that right now. And so there's certain things that we would have to do very, very quickly to facilitate such a change in a very short amount of time. So I just want you to be aware of that as far as process and procedures as we look to communicate with our families and students with the school year starting very, very shortly.
Thank you for that, Anne Marie. Dr. Gandhi, is it appropriate for me to ask you your thoughts on this in regard to, we're talking almost about potentially an immediate action, depending upon the sentiment of the board tonight. So is there anything that you would like to share on that regard?
Yeah, I think the question is, this conversation I think has gone convoluted because we're mixing intent, action, and process. And I think we can be very strategic in terms of what we want to do. I'm excited for the committee to come up with standards for renaming schools, and I think from our conversation, what we know already about Woodrow Wilson, I can't imagine that the standards that we establish that we want for our facilities, that name would still hold true. However, I also believe that we are educators, so if we are going to change a name, we need to tell our community why, we need to tell our students why, and we need to say and involve them in that process. So for me, if the board wants to take immediate action, which could be the right action to take on changing the name Woodrow Wilson, you can take that action today, but make the name, when the name changes effective by a certain date. I think it was suggested earlier by the next school year, or give that time, but you're still taking action today that this board is committed to changing that name. So it's more of that process versus what is the intent of what we're trying to do. I think that's why earlier I said there's three separate things. There's the standards on which we use to change the name. There's the name itself, and then what is the process for a new name. And those are at least three just small parts of this conversation, but there's so much more as well. And there's community engagement, there's student and alumni engagement. So how does all of that fit in? So I think that's kind of where I'm at.
Thank you, Dr. Gandhi. Jennifer.
Okay, I'm going to attempt to offer an amendment to this motion. I know, that's brave. And just by inserting a few words, try and reach your intent. And that is, the motion asks to remove the name Woodrow Wilson immediately. The challenge being it needs a temporary name, so I would continue the motion by amending it and saying, and to assign it the temporary name of Central High School, is that what you said? Community High School, until the Communications Committee, Communications and Advocacy Committee can complete their work. Does that achieve?
Is there a second to that amendment?
Jennifer, I can just verify, did you say Central High School?
Community, Central Community, or just Community High School? Community High School.
Community High School?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a second to that?
Second.
Discussion? I have a question to ask. And this goes to Dr. Gandhi, by assigning a temporary name and by potentially dropping the name Woodrow Wilson immediately, what additional confusion does that create? Do we need to be creating a temporary name? Thinking about the communication pieces that Anne Marie was discussing with us earlier, I'm hesitant on myself a temporary name because I feel like it might add even additional confusion. I would like whatever happens regarding this to be as tight and simple to understand as humanly possible, knowing that there's lots of communication that the school district is putting out. Dr. Gandhi.
I think having a temporary name could be very problematic in terms of just how did you pick that temporary name, and then we have the community and the students and the alumni have to go through 2 shifts essentially. I think if the goal is to make a commitment to dropping that name, then why wouldn't we rather invoke say board take action to start the process for renaming the school, and then let that process run its place, and then the name only lives until that new process is put in.
There was suggestion earlier this evening about having that be effective by the 2021-22 school year. So there would be action that would be happening. There would be a decision that would be made if this were to go forward. But there would be a process that we've already talked about earlier this evening that would allow that dialogue and that discussion within our community to take place. And then there would be a deadline, for example, that was suggested of the 2021-22 school year. But that's not what was in the amendment. So what was in the amendment to the motion is another name, a temporary name. So we have to decide on that. If there's any other discussion.
You will be voting on the amendment to insert the words into the motion of, and to assign the temporary name Community High School until the Communications, Engagement, and Advocacy Committee can complete their work. Newman?
No.
Paulson?
No.
Benson?
Yes.
Gullickson?
Yes.
Holden?
Yes.
Johnson?
No.
Nelson?
No.
Knutson?
Motion fails? Correct. Is there any other work that needs to be done tonight regarding Memo 23? Jim?
I thought that was the amendment.
Suggestion.
I'm sorry, and that was an amendment. Jim, sorry, go ahead.
I just want to give a suggestion for us to consider, because obviously, I think we all want the same end result. It's what's the right process to get us there. There's reason to take action, but there's no reason to take action tonight. We'll have another school board meeting here in August. We have 2 in September. Maybe the right thing to do right now is to recognize that we've passed a resolution or a motion that has a policy to get created that we can vet all of the current buildings on, and maybe we look to kind of just take a 2-week hiatus and come back. I personally would really like to not rename Woodrow Wilson High School until we at least give the students that are currently enrolled there an opportunity to tell us, yes, do it now, do it at the end of the school year, and maybe whoever is the liaison to that particular building could go engage with them early in September. And, you know, obviously the community is going to be hearing that we're talking about renaming this building. We don't need to dream up a new name today, and I think it's a mistake to try and do it.
I did want to clarify that it was an amendment that did not pass, so we're back to the original motion. And the original motion, Anne Marie, is
that the board immediately remove the name Woodrow Wilson from the high school.
Is there any other discussion on that? Hearing no. Nikki?
My biggest concern with that is if we were to vote to remove that name, if there were enough of us to pass that, what do we call it?
I believe, as Dr. Gross mentioned earlier, we could refer to it by a plant number.
Okay, well, that makes me chuckle a little bit, but I think a temporary name or an interim name would be better than calling it a number. But
So as we've discussed earlier this evening, I wouldn't support a temporary name. We've had that discussion today. We've discussed all the different kinds of communication pieces that are going to need to go out that just happen as a result of the school year starting. Dr. Gandhi has given his recommendation in terms of advice on a temporary name, and I would look to him for his guidance on that. And I believe that if the motion passes, that administration will figure out an appropriate way to refer to that school, and then that the policy, AP 3260, would be in effect. Any other discussion? Tracy?
I would just like to add, I am going to vote no on this only because of the process involved, and I respect what you guys are saying. I am a part of this new committee that will be involved in renaming it, and we can make it the utmost urgent first item action on that committee. So I just want to be clear, I too appreciate your intent, and I think it is urgent. It could be our first item of business, but I'm going to vote no just based on the logistics that were explained here tonight. Thank you.
Jennifer?
So after listening to the presenters this evening and all of this discussion, I agree with you, Tracy, in terms of the process. I respect the process and more than anything, allowing an opportunity for students and the public to be a part of this conversation. However, I do think it is a conversation that's been happening for quite some time at some varying levels. And I think that tonight we have an opportunity to say we recognize that regardless of the outcome of what the name might be, we recognize that, and this is our opportunity to say, we no longer support this name. To me, that doesn't say we don't support the process of including students and the public in naming the facility, because we're still going to do that, and that's important for them to have an opportunity to participate. So I was prepared, to come in here and vote like that, but the more I listen and the more I consider that really this is our time to really make a statement. So I'm prepared to vote yes.
I too am a member of that committee that will be involved in the process we talked about earlier, but I'll vote yes this evening for the reasons that I gave prior. Any other discussion? Nikki?
And I too will be supporting this motion because I think it's time that we take some action. When I hear that it's been 3 years, I mean, I knew it's been some time, but the events of recent have pushed us. I think we need to be responsive. I think we need to be listening to what people say. And as far as all the materials and everything that go out, I can live with two things, either saying that we will be discussing this and working on this throughout the school year and we will have a plan change, because that still sends a message that we are active on it, we are working on it. But I think this needs to go sooner than later, or we're going to walk out of here and hear they pushed it off again. It's going to get kicked down the road. And I think we're getting more pressure because of the events of today. And like I've said and others have said, there's been no one that says, please keep that name. Please don't change that name. I really don't anticipate that's going to be the issue. With all due respect, I do want to talk to the students. I do want to talk to the faculty. I do want to hear from the alumni. I want as much involvement as possible. But I do think it's time maybe to we know there's community pressure to be done with this name.
Dr. Gandhi?
I think my question is, if the position of the board is the name is done, which, I think no one here is defending the name, what is the value add of dropping the name effective today versus making or suggesting that the name no longer be used past the end of this school year or a certain point? If the goal is to say that that name is no longer acceptable, if it's just a process thing.
We don't have that language in the motion right now. There would have to be an amendment. Robin, had your hand up?
I did. What I'm hearing right now in the discussion is a vote to make a statement. And it's a statement that I don't disagree with. I would caution the board to consider the workload, the tremendous workload of our administration right now, not only from an instructional standpoint, but communicating with our parents. And you heard also from our parents excessively over the last couple weeks that they want more communication about how the school is going to open. So I think that's where the efforts of the cabinet and their team need to be at this time. And I really do not think it is harmful to the process to give it a little bit more time. Making a statement vote comes with repercussions. I don't disagree with this statement, but please think about the ripple effects of this action tonight.
Tracy?
Thank you. Sorry, I agree. I agree with the sentiment, and I think we have responded to the public, and we just want to make sure we're thorough in the way that we do our response correct and not acting too quickly. And frankly, there's many that I'd be interested in changing. I did a lot of research about Agassiz as well, and so just to point to this one, Woodrow Wilson, I think there's further work to be done. I'm excited to be on the committee to do this work, and I am pledging to the public to do that. So I do think we've responded tonight.
Anything else? Anyone else? Anne Marie, please call the roll.
Does anybody need the motion reread?
Please
Maybe
reread
just
it.
for the
Thank
good of
you.
the order, would you please?
Oh, David, sorry.
Are we voting on the motion now?
Correct. The motion on the floor is that the board immediately remove the name Woodrow Wilson from the high school.
Thank you for rereading that, Anne Marie.
Paulson.
No.
Benson.
Yes.
Gullickson.
Yes.
Holden.
Yes.
Johnson.
No.
Nelson.
No.
Newman.
No.
Knutson.
Yes.
Fails by a tie.
Thank you, everyone, this evening for the discussion. Okay, we'll resume the meeting now, please. I was instructed to wave so that you know that, that we're getting started back there. And I see thumbs up. Good deal. All right. We are moving to item C. David?
Rebecca, I would like to make a motion to immediately begin a process to examine renaming Woodrow Wilson High School.
Second.
There's been a motion to begin a process to immediately, actually, David, would you please reread that?
To immediately begin a process to examine renaming Woodrow Wilson High School.
Okay, and that was seconded by you, Jim? Yep. All right, thank you. Any discussion? Any discussion? Anne Marie, please call the roll. Benson.
Yes.
Gullickson.
Yes.
Holden.
Yes.
Johnson.
Yes.
Nelson.
Yes.
Newman.
Yes.
Paulson.
Yes.
Knutson. Yes. Motion passes. Great. Sorry for not seeing you right away, David. Now we're on to item C, busing services, or contract for busing services memo 20. Jennifer had requested it be moved from the consent agenda to business. Jennifer, since you made that request, I assume you have some questions.
Yes.
Feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Rebecca. Ooh, I can hear myself now on speaker. So I asked for it to be pulled just to give an opportunity. We reviewed this during, throughout COVID at the planning committee meeting, but haven't had a chance since it was renewed and modified since then and renegotiated. And so I thought it was important to just ask or give Jackie an opportunity to give us the highlights on that.
Jackie's down at the end there.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, I'm here. Yes, we did discuss some options specifically related to COVID throughout the entire spring, I guess, and didn't come to anything specific as far as an amendment. And with the contract at its end of its 5-year term, felt then it was an opportune time to not just approve the renewal for another 5 years, but to actually look at the contract both from Fargo School standpoint as well as Valley Bus's standpoint. And so we did that. We did probably the most significant changes. Of course, there's always wording and some other things to tweak in there. But we did add a paragraph that essentially does state that in the event of a significant loss of days. Right now, the contract remains at a 50% pay, and that is still in there. However, just adds that both parties will make a good faith effort to have discussions should the need arise that puts either party at significant risk of loss. Should an event happen again that delays school and we are not in session. As well, we are working towards Valley Bus maintaining a $5 million motor vehicle liability. That was a significant jump. It was at $1 million, so we will work towards that. We increased it to $2 million for the upcoming contract term. And then the rest is basically the same. Rates typically increase at about that 3% level every year per the CPI index that is out there. So, and we left in the terms to have the ability just to automatically renew for another term. But I would anticipate maybe in another 5 years we'll be in the same situation where it's just a good time to relook at the contract and tweak any language. And I did have our attorney also take a peek at the contract and what we've added, and they had no suggestions to change with what was presented to them. So are there any other questions?
Thank you, Jackie. Robin?
So when you talk about the adjustment to the motor vehicle liability insurance from $1 million to $2 million, is this their liability policy and we are named?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Does anyone else have Additional questions?
And the $5 million recommendation actually just has come on behalf of our insurance company saying, you know, really, this is what we should try to get to at some point, so.
Any other questions? Jennifer?
Thank you, Jackie. So, you know, you did mention the escalator, which I know it's been in there year after year, but I didn't see, are there parameters or things that they have to meet in terms of like on time? I know that there is the other way around, but, you know, to receive that or at any time, no?
Sorry, automatic inflator that is listed in the contract.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? All right, seems like we're ready to vote. Anne Marie? Robin, did you have a question?
There's no motion on the floor.
Oh, I'm sorry, goodness. Is there going to be one?
Yes.
Okay.
I will make the motion to approve the transportation contract between Fargo Public Schools and Valley Bus LLC.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, motion has been made and a second. Now, is there any discussion? Any additional discussion, I guess? All right, hearing none, Anne Marie, would you please call the roll?
Gullickson.
Yes.
Holden.
Yes.
Johnson.
Yes.
Nelson.
Yes.
Newman.
Yes.
Paulson.
Yes.
Benson.
Yes.
Knutson.
Yes, motion passes. All right, on to board reports, committee liaison and correspondence reports. Robin, how about if we start with you?
Thank you. Let's see here. Try to go in order. July 22nd, I attended the North Dakota School Boards Association virtual meeting. July 23rd was a governance committee meeting. July 30th was, of course, our special meeting. August 10th, I serve as an alternate on the instructional panel committee, an alternate to replace Tracy if she's unavailable. Alternates can listen in but cannot participate in the conversation and not vote. But that was a great panel of people that had some really good conversation. And then with the newly appointed committees, we will be working for governmental affairs to send out a doodle poll for the first meeting. And typically, these would be kind of an organizational meeting to talk about the work plan for the year. And it's a pretty set in stone calendar, so we just have to put our places in between. So it will be a busy, busy legislative year, and I really thank you for your appointment to lead that committee.
Thank you, Robin. Jim?
Since our special board meeting, we had an SEEC board meeting where we talked a lot about reopening plans for all the different school districts, and we talked about a new fund that's going to be made available to all of our member districts to access additional dollars for professional development that they might want to do. And once I see what those numbers are and what we're eligible for, I'll get those to Dr. Bob, so he can hopefully have a few more dollars to spend. I attended the DPI, North Dakota School Boards Association, board member orientation meeting, and we had a National School Board Policies and Resolution Committee and approved all of the resolutions that are going to be put forward at the national board meeting, which I think is coming up here. I want to say August 24th, but I may be off on that date. It'll be a virtual meeting this year. And I think that's it.
Thank you, Jim. David?
I attended the special board meeting on July 30th, and that's been it so far.
Jennifer?
I too was at the special meeting on July 30th. I've received many, many emails and correspondence and had phone conversations, mostly specific to Carl Ben area reassignment, as well as our future or our discussion that will be happening this evening. So I think I'll share those for our next work session. And then I would
I am sad to leave to be leaving the Health Insurance Committee, but I'm also excited to be picking up the liaison assignment for the Youth Initiative Committee. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Jennifer. Nikki?
I attended several of the things you guys did. July 14th was actually our first board meeting, so being a little new to this, I don't have the long list you guys do yet, but July 22nd, the DPI school board training, July 30th, of course, our special meeting, August 6th, the virtual academy, Zoom meeting I was a part of. I also attended one parent and one staff Smart Restart meeting that we had for those. I've had several PTA things. We had our conference, and it was spread over 3 weeks. And so a couple days each week were spent on those, learning more about the advocacy and all the things that we do at a national level, various trainings there. I'm excited to work on the communication and advocacy, engagement and advocacy committee. I'm looking forward to the people that I work with. I'm looking forward to the work ahead, and working with administration on establishing some of those new policies. And I am excited for my liaisons and the various places that Rebecca has felt would be good for me to participate in. I'm looking forward to learning a lot of new things.
Thank you, Nikki. Seth?
I attended, obviously, special board meeting on July 30th. Also on July 16th, I attended the initial selection committee for Fargo Police Chief, which Dr. Gandhi is on that committee. I hope everything's going well. And in a couple weeks, from August 24th through 27th, is when we're going to be hosting Lunch Aid this year to raise money to pay off school debt. Several local bands will be playing that, but it'll be a virtual event this year rather than an in-person event. All 4 nights, the 24th, 25th, 26th, and 27th, can be viewed at 7:30 at night on local production company Livewire's Facebook page. And the goal to raise this year is $20,000. And the last I looked, before we even have had the event, we're at $10,500. So it's looking pretty good that we'll get there, but we need people to watch and support. So thanks.
Thank you, Seth. Tracy?
Thank you. On July 21st, I attended the Governor's Summit on Innovative Education. It was all virtual this year. Very interesting, learned a lot. I think I've been so worried about my time toward COVID that I went ahead and did both my liaison visits to my liaison schools, which was very fun. I visited Lewis and Clark, met with Principal Cressup, and I visited here at South, where I met with Dr. Bursch, and I had a tour, and he gave me some swag that I'm wearing tonight. I got even left with some South golf balls. It was very fun. On July 23rd, I attempted to call into the governance meeting, had technical difficulties. I, of course, was at our special board meeting as well. On August 4th, I had a meeting with Sanford senior leadership just regarding trying to obtain some medical information and maybe trends we're seeing in our hospital related to COVID, so I can bring that to the special instructional plan committee that we're on. I found that very productive. On August 5th, we are supposed to do the sports physicals here at South. That is moved to 2 future dates, so stay tuned for that. And then, of course, yesterday on August 10th, we did have our first 2.5-hour-long meeting of the COVID-19 Instructional Plan Committee meeting. I also wanted to share that I joined the parent focus group related to special education throughout the year, and I'm happy to bring reports coming forward for that as we begin to meet. And I, too, had on my list to talk about Lunch Aid. Very cool, August 24th through 27th. There'll be 7 bands featured over 4 nights. Each show is live streamed. As you guys know, last year they raised $20,000 to pay off our lunch debt for Fargo Public Schools. And a special plug, Seth Holden's band, Human Element, is one of the bands playing. So please tune in. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. My report includes that the Core Neighborhood Steering Committee will be meeting on the 18th of August at City Hall. The Native American Commission met last Thursday, August 18th at 4 o'clock. I I believe we all received an email on this, but a call with State Superintendent Baszler just to receive some additional updates since the last meeting that was held. So I will be on that. And Anne Marie, I know you're going to public notice that in case others of us are on that call as well. I was at the press conference July 31st. Thanks for the work putting that together, everyone that was involved. Also attended the Governor's Summit on Innovative Education, July 23rd governance. I will be gone for our next board meeting. Robin has volunteered in her role as vice president to chair that meeting, and I will visit with you, Anne Marie, to see if there's a way that we can set up an opportunity for me to call in, because I'm hoping I can do that. And that's the end of my report. So then we're on to our next meeting, and that is August 25th. I'm assuming it's going to be in this room. If not, we will let folks know, but assume that it's going to be here. There's a thumbs up back there. It says, yes, we're here. Okay. We're ready to go on the work session? Okay. All right, Robin, thank you. Have a good night. Okay, as also publicly noticed, the board is meeting in a work session this evening. It's a little bit more of an informal meeting and discussion that we're going to be having, and we have the main purpose of that meeting indicated that it is attendance boundaries for Far South Fargo, and so it's an opportunity for us to have discussion regarding the items that are listed on this agenda. It is not customary for us to take votes during work sessions. There will be details that we feel necessary that result from this the dialogue during this work session that would be brought to future regular board meetings for action. So I will call our work session to order, and I will say that it is 7:47 p.m. And we will move right into number 2, attendance boundaries for Far South Fargo, and a presentation from administration. Thank you to Dr. Gandhi and to Dr. Gross.
Thank you, board members. This evening, I think for our board members that aren't new, the presentation that you'll see it won't be anything new. I think when administration was given the directive to bring boundary recommendations for the Discovery Davies to potentially alleviate the overcrowdedness that's projected for Discovery and Davies, we had said at that time and informed the board that we would be bringing forth the top 2 recommendations from the task force that we conducted last year. That task force had 7 meetings, and they went through 30 plus boundary scenarios. None of the scenarios achieved consensus, which was at that task force we had decided consensus was going to be 80% of the votes, but there were 2, I believe, recommendations that actually had majority or more people vote in favor versus against. I mean, I think at the end of the day, this conversation has been part of Fargo Public Schools, I think even prior to me starting, I believe, since 2017, knowing that what our enrollment numbers are looking for in Far South Fargo. So it has been a very difficult decision, and I think ultimately the board is going to have to decide what are the factors that we're using to make a decision for boundary recommendations. So what we are going to do today is just review the task force data and the task force recommendations. We have updated potential numbers based on enrollment now and based on the board action that was taken for a central Fargo, I'll call it Claire Barton neighborhood, changes that we made. And then we'll review updated recommendations, but then at the, we'll also give the opportunity for the board, if they want to have Dr. Gross provide potential numbers for different scenarios that they want to explore, what that can look like. So with that being said, I will hand it over to Dr. Gross.
Well, thank you very much. So what I'd like to just reiterate is what Dr. Gandhi mentioned is between March 18th of 2019 and June 4th of 2019, We had our 7 meetings with 46 different task force members. Those task force members represented our different areas of our community. And we then went through a process, like was mentioned, to look at I think it was 36 different scenarios or variations of different scenarios. And in your packet tonight is a document that I'm wondering if are we going to project? The first information is the packet that says current middle school, and you'll see there's a map of, and the key is yellow, kind of a pink and so on. What I'd like to draw your attention to on this entire packet, that this was information that the task force looked at their last meeting, and please notice that there is a date stamp on that of June 4th, 2019. So any of the data that's associated with any of the current boundaries or one of the scenarios that are listed in this packet was based on that time frame. Obviously, as our district changes and we know our mobility rate in our system is close to 30% over a course of an entire school year, the numbers are different today. But what we wanted to do is just provide you some of the information that the committee looked at. So just to kind of think through this packet, the first page of it would be the middle school boundaries at that time. And you'll see the color code that's there for the map. I think that was important because sometimes as you look at the maps, they are a little bit difficult to read with all of the blue lines that are on there. But those blue lines are actually the elementary boundaries. So if you're wondering where an elementary school boundary is, that would be indicated by those blue lines on the map. And then in the bottom right-hand corner of that page, or any of the pages in this packet, you will see kind of a breakdown of the demographics according to that map. How we get this data is we use a piece of software, it's called Guide K-12, and each of our students are basically geocoded to their homes so that if there are 3 students living in a particular area or home, we know that based upon their address. You will notice that on some of the data sets, we have redacted or blacked out some of the information, and that's just to follow our practice of any time there is a data set of 10 or less, we redact that because it becomes more easily to identify individual students, and we certainly didn't want to do that through this process. So that first page would have been the current boundaries, again, on the 4th of June. The second page was the current boundaries when we talk about the high school. Again, that same time frame, the 4th of June. And I'm certainly not going to go through all of these, but what I want to do is just the third page in is the first scenario that the group looked at, and you'll notice that this one is actually labeled Scenario 8. We talked earlier that we walked through over 33 different scenarios, and it was as they became whittled down by the task force. We studied some of them in greater detail. Number 8 was one of them. This is one of the scenarios that actually followed a true feeder system, where you'll notice where those blue lines are on the map that indicate the elementary schools. That was a true feeder system to the middle school and the high school. And then, just like the rest of the pages, you can see the demographic information is in the lower bottom right. So the committee, or the task force, had all of this information. They broke into small table groups, had conversations about the positives, the negatives out of each of these plans. And then as we progressed meeting after meeting, new suggestions were created. They were drawn. This information was given to the task force, and we continued that process. So I wanted to give you this packet, so as I bring you some more information, if you're curious what that scenario looked like, you would be able to refer back to it. The second set of data that we wanted to share with you tonight for this conversation was an exercise that we did with the committee or the task force on the last evening. was to see if there was consensus around any of those different scenarios. But before we did that, we asked a question of the group, and that was, do the middle school and the high school boundaries need to be the same? We asked that participants use their phone in an anonymous way of recording their report or their votes. And what you can see is when we asked that question, 75% of the individuals who were there that evening said, yes, they do need to be the same in their opinion. But then we had some very good conversation around the word need. And the task force said, there's a difference between need to be the same and should be the same. So we updated the question, and we asked that question in a different format. Should the middle school and high school boundaries be the same? And you can see that that had a different percentage, and in that case, it was up to 89% of the task force who said they should be the same. And that was a great conversation that we had just around a simple word of need or should as we had those conversations. Then, like Dr. Gandhi mentioned earlier, we walked through each of those scenarios to see if there was consensus to move one of those scenarios or multiple scenarios to the board. So we started with scenario 8, and that was that first one that I shared with you in the other packet. And the question was, should scenario 8 continue to be considered as a potential recommendation to the board? And you can see what the results were from the members who were there. And then we looked at both the middle school version of that and the high school version of that. And you can see the data and how it was shared back by the group. We then went through each of the different scenarios that were still talked about. For example, this next one was scenario 9, and that's also in the other packet, if you'd like to refer back to that. And when we asked that same question about should that one be considered as a potential recommendation to be moved forward, you'll see that in that case, 68% of the respondents said, yes, it should when it comes to the middle school version of it. And when we looked at the high school, it was 64%. Again, did not meet the threshold of 80% consensus that the group had set as a norm at the beginning of the process. But this was one of the two scenarios that had more yeses or a higher percentage of yeses than nos as we went through the process. Then if you continue to look through that packet, you'll see other scenarios like 9.15 is on the next page, and the data that went with it, according to the members of that committee. Again, that one had a majority of no, that one should not move forward, 9.15. 9.17, that was another scenario that the committee, there was at least a larger portion of yeses than nos. When it came to the middle school scenario, it was 71% said yes, we should consider that. And when we looked at the high school, it was 64. Again, not meeting the threshold that was set at the very first meeting of the task force of trying to get to 80%, but it did have a majority that said yes as we looked at those two scenarios. And then if you go through the remainder of the different scenarios in the voting, you will see that there was not another scenario that met or had a higher percentage of yes than no in both the middle school and the high school components. So that's the second packet that we wanted to provide for you tonight, just for your conversation. And then the third set of data that's in front of you was just to update those information or that pieces of data so that you would have it with more current information. So what we've provided for you tonight on the front page of that one, and now this is the one that has blue, green, and gray shaded in areas on the map. This would be the current middle school set of boundaries as of July 2nd. And I want to draw your attention to that date because what we do is once a month we update a data set into this Guide K-12 set of software. When I ran these reports to have them prepared for you ahead of time, that was the most current data set that we had. But obviously, since the 2nd of July, we've had some students move in, some students move out of our district. But I wanted to call your attention to that date. And just like the other data packet, you will see a key and then the graphic or the spreadsheet of the demographics related to it. The second page would be the current high school set of boundaries and the data set. And just because we thought you may wonder about the approved modified boundaries that were set on June 9th at your meeting, what would that do to this current year's set of students? We updated that. So if you look in this area to the east of University Drive in the Claire Barton Hawthorne area, that entire zone down to the interstate or 94 is moved to Fargo North and Ben Franklin. Although that does not officially take place until next school year, we wanted to provide you the data of what that would look like if it was in place currently. So you'll have that piece of information to look at and discuss tonight with the data set. So you have the middle school and the high school. And then finally, what we did for your conversations this evening is went back to the task force and the two recommendations that had the largest percentages of yes, and updated that based upon July 2nd data of this year. So you will see what scenario 9 looks like today for the middle school and the corresponding data set for when we look at demographics for both the middle school and the high school. And then finally, you'll have scenario 9.17 updated based on July 2nd, 2020. So again, what we wanted to do is just provide an overview or a recap of the task force and the work they did so that you had that for your conversation tonight. Update 2 of the different scenarios so that you had that to look at and to discuss.
Thank you, Dr. Gross. Jennifer, in one second. Dr. Gandhi, I know you and I visited earlier today. I'd just like to have a little bit of a conversation ahead of time before we get started in terms of where we're going to want to go with this. Per my conversation with Dr. Gandhi, we talked about an opportunity to potentially have action ultimately on something. We need to have action on something. We're going to need to be going forward and making some decisions regarding boundaries and for the far south Fargo. So an idea could be, depending upon the conversation that we have here tonight, would be at one of our September meetings that it would be on the agenda to take some action based on whatever we talk about tonight. So that would be either September 8th or the 22nd. And so I just wanted that information just kind of out there for us to think about so that we have kind of a focal point that we're trying to drive towards and get us, help make decisions so that administration can plan and that families can make plans. So is that what we talked about?
Yeah, I think ultimately the goal, I think administration just needs direction. So what is our directive after tonight or for future board action?
Thank you. Jennifer.
Okay, if I may, I have a couple of clarifying questions, Bob. So as you were presenting the survey results and the number of committees, I just want to make sure that, so you said there were 46 committee members, but on your slide, it was 27 people voted. Is that right?
Yes, so at the initial meeting, when I would say the majority of the task force members were present, we created a set of norms. And that part of the norms were, consensus was 80% of those who were present that evening. Because we knew that some members may not be able to be at all meetings. I know most committee members did their very best to be at them all, but there were some things that caused a member or multiple members not to be present. So on the night that we did this exercise, you will see a difference between 27 or 28 individuals who responded.
If I may ask a follow-up or a second question. When you were talking about split or surveying middle school, high school, did the most recent update to the boundary that included CVE neighborhood and Ben Franklin North, South, didn't that split the middle school?
So in the original packet that has, I would say, the yellow, the pink, and the brown color coding,
Yeah.
scenario 8, I believe, is the one maybe we're talking about, and that's the true feeder system. I did not rerun that data, but I certainly can. The two pieces that we ran for tonight to put in your packet were the two scenarios that had the highest approval rating from the task force.
To clarify, so thank you for that too, but the 2 months ago, the most recent boundary modification, and there was a carve-out left, that's the one I'm curious about.
So in the packet, and I'm sorry that I'm referring to them by color code, it would be the one that has the blue, the green, and the gray. I believe that is on the third page in. That is the current boundaries with what you approved as a board on June 9th included. So you'll see that University Drive all the way down to 94 to the east. That is shaded in blue for Ben Franklin and North High School. The section of Clara Barton Hawthorne that is to the west of there is still shaded in green, which according to what was approved still goes to Carl Ben Eielson and Fargo South.
Which will go into effect for the 2021 school year, just so everybody's assured about that.
And creates the split, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and currently, if we look at our current boundaries, and that is on the front of that packet, that neighborhood is already split. It's just a different road or natural boundary that is the southern part of that boundary.
Jim?
Bob, I don't suppose you have your software here. Can you tell me, and if you don't have it tonight, that's okay, it could be a follow-up. As I'm looking at both scenario 9 and is it 9.17, it looks like the Prairie Wood neighborhood is being allocated to North High and Ben Franklin in that, as well as the neighborhood that's to the north of 13th Avenue and to the west of 25th Street. Now, I don't think there are too many children actually living in that part that's to the north of 13th Avenue, but there probably are a few. What are the student counts in Prairie Wood and that other neighborhood?
And I believe he does have the software.
Yes, I believe he does.
Yeah.
I do. So if you're looking at the neighborhood that is Prairie Wood, that division or subdivision in our community, right now at the middle level, we have 35 middle school age students. If I go to the high school, there are 58 high school age students in that neighborhood.
Any other questions, Jim, right now? Okay. Any,
Can you show us that on the map, which area you just carved out for that number? Like, are you able to do that?
Yeah, and are you just looking for, on the map, which areas?
Just for, reference point,
Yep.
because there's no, the streets, I can't even see them.
Yeah, I think we could do that. I think, and I'll just, Guide K-12 had given us some guidance and just when you're at a work session or a board meeting, because these students geocoded and you can accidentally hover over students, not to display it or do it that way. So that's why Dr. Gross was disconnecting. But if it's just the map and that neighborhood,
Yeah.
we can absolutely do that. We just want to make sure we're protecting certain information, but we can still run any scenarios you need as well.
So I took off the overlay of where the students are in their households, just for this conversation, so they're not shown on the screen. The area that was just asked of me is this area right here, which would be the Prairiewood area. And that's where those number of students, both at the middle school and the high school, are associated.
Mike, please. Jim, Mike.
I think on scenario 9 and 917, though, you only have half of the Prairiewood neighborhood indicated going to north. So were the 35 and 58 the entire Prairiewood neighborhood?
So what I have in the box there is the numbers that I just shared with you.
Okay.
If I would go to the north of there and then look at this section of our community, and I'll go to middle school first. There's actually 71 middle schoolers currently, and high school there are 74.
I have a question. Since we have the recommendations, the results from the task force, and there are two that got to the highest level, are we going to be able to focus our conversations regarding those two and go from there? Or are there, because we have so many maps in front of us, it's great, we can put every exercise together, but just at some point, we'll have to have some kind of a focus on it, and I do want to point out that there are those two after going through that task force. I for sure want to have discussions regarding those two and look to honor the work that the task force did. Doesn't mean that I'm in favor of one or the other, but want to make sure that we have good dialogue regarding those two. Nikki, did you have your hand up?
I do have a question. I was on that task force, and I can attest to how good Bob is with this software, because he's really good. Another question that I have is besides just housing and placement, other pieces that we looked at were things like diversity and free and reduced lunch and different things like that. We wanted to have as much diverse population as we could all the way around. So it isn't just about where the kids are living in the houses that they're in and what plot of land it lives on. So how far do we want to go with those discussions tonight? Because I think that's part of the reason the task force had some trouble putting recommendations forth, is trying to keep things as even keeled as we possibly could.
Yep, exactly, and I would point us to page 14 of our long-range facility plan that has the information on the guiding principles for facility decisions, and then guidelines for setting school attendance boundaries. And so, Nikki, you're talking about under the guidelines for setting school attendance boundaries, under number 1, the last bullet point there, strive to balance socioeconomic mix when setting secondary attendance areas. Under the guideline principles for facility decisions, a couple that we might want to, pay attention to all of them, but I would say that most of these plans cover most of the items here, so that there might be a couple of additional, areas we want to focus. But number 5, the preference is to minimize as much as possible the travel and distance to and from school for all students in each attendance boundary area. And number 7, the preference is to have a middle school to high school attendance boundary feeder system. It doesn't mean that the order here is any preferred order or any designated ranking. And I know that there was a challenge for the task force, to come up with an agreed upon ranking. But, so we don't have that ranking here either. And as I looked at the plans, again, I feel like most of the plans address under our guiding principles for facility decisions, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 6. And then under setting school attendance boundaries, overall address point number 1, the first 2 bullet points there. It talks about equitable, not equal space. Strive for equitable, but not necessarily equal number of students per classroom. And then the second item here talks about transportation costs and just taking that into consideration. So I don't have too many concerns about most of the items listed under our guiding principles. I don't think the plans themselves would be put together even in front of us if they didn't fit within lots of these areas. Tracy and then Jennifer.
Thank you. I had a question just regarding the virtual academy numbers. Do we have data, and how is that a discussion we need to have, and how that would affect these numbers?
Dr. Gross, who wants to speak to that?
I can give Dr. Gross to give you the exact number because he has his laptop in front of him, which I don't. So absolutely going to be part of the conversation in terms of a timeline. Just want to be able to tell board members the virtual academy exists now because of the governor's executive order that allows us to provide that opportunity and count instructional time. So unless there is legislative change at this legislative session, we will not be able to continue the virtual academy in the form that we're offering it this year. And then the second question is, if that legislative change does happen, then when we are back to a new normal, what is going to be the participation in that academy? Is the numbers that you're going to get today a product of that or not? And those are just some unknowns in terms of legislatively, and then the future of being able to provide that if we have that option.
Dr. Gross.
So earlier in the evening, we were asked the number of students who have signed up or families who have signed up. And since then, I re-looked at the data, and now it's 1,294 students across our system. Now that is K through 12. We have approximately anywhere from 100 to about 125 at each of our secondary buildings, middle school and high school. Now it varies within there, but that's the approximate range at each of those middle schools and high schools.
Jennifer.
Okay, so I just wanted to respond to your initial question in terms of paring it down. And I guess from my perspective, I would say a lot of time has gone by and a lot of things have happened and a lot of things have been said. And I think that really, from my perspective, I would encourage us to really take a fresh look, because I can tell you that there were many people that believed those guiding principles were placed in order of importance, and I don't know that is, well, I know actually that's not how the board necessarily intended it to be. And so whether that was miscommunication or not, I do think that because we are sitting around this table and have been talking about it for a very long time, I really would encourage us to try to look at it through fresh eyes and really take our guiding principles. Because I can tell you, when looking at these maps, there are inequities we would create if we just limit it to these two here. And they are inequities that do not exist throughout the rest of our district. And to me, as one board member, that's hundreds of students and families you're talking about. And so I think it's important to consider that. When you're talking about a middle school that is 6 to 7 miles away from some of the neighborhoods that these two plans carve out, and you don't have that, it doesn't exist for your other middle schools, that concerns me. There's no safe route to school. So socioeconomics was important, right? And it rose to the top as kind of the most important in terms of paring down these plans. When I look at these strengths and weaknesses, I see as a board member who's got guiding principles on her mind and, you know, throughout every decision that we make and trying to provide this equitable opportunity across our community, I see the true feeder system rising to the top, you know, in terms of longevity and the most equitable experience. Our neighbors do true feeder system in West Fargo. I think that we should not just dismiss it. I think this is our opportunity, again, to really look at what do our boundaries currently look like? And can we achieve, it's not like, it shouldn't be just a numbers game. We have to consider, how are these middle schoolers going to get to school safely? What is that going to do to their families? And these plans don't achieve that. That concerns me. And if you look at even the demographics, I could take it one step farther, and if you look at the heat maps on these maps, you will see that you are putting kiddos that are already at risk. They can currently walk a mile to their school if they need to be, if their parents are working 3 jobs, 2 jobs, 1 job, both of them working. If you move them 7 miles away, they can't do that. So what does that mean for after-school activity participation? These are very important questions that we as a board should be spending more time talking about, I think. And again, it is about hundreds of kids, not just a few.
Anything else right now? What we could do is, again, on number 14, on page 14, just so that we have we have record that we've had this discussion, go through the guiding principles for facility decisions and reaffirm them and see if there's one that needs to stand out or for some reason some of these maps don't represent. The first one, provide education for all students in suitable space, resources, staffing, and educational opportunities in all district schools. Is there potentially a plan that's being presented to us that does not include that? Number 2, the number of students per class is an important criterion when planning for school facilities. The preference for average class size is, and now we're not talking primary, we're going on to secondary and intermediate. Intermediate 22, secondary 26 average. Are all these plans based on that criteria? Yes, okay. Number 3, the preference for school size let's skip to middle school grades. So middle school grades 6 through 8, 850 to 1,000. And in high schools, grades 9 through 12, 1,100 to 1,350. Are we overall within that range? I feel as if we are. Dr. Gross, do you have something to add?
Yes, the only modification would be Discovery Middle School is designed for 1,100 students. That's the capacity of that building.
But there is an adjusted capacity, isn't there, which is 800 some? Or am I not right on that?
Right now, based upon a feeder system of Davies or Discovery to Davies, if we look at Davies being designed for 1,350, you divide that by 4, and if it was a perfect world and you had that many 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders, which we know doesn't always happen, and then you multiply that number by 3, we get to that 1,107, I believe it is.
And I'm sorry, you were talking about Discovery.
Yes.
Right? I was talking about Carl Ben.
Oh.
And so my question was, we have the capacity at 1025, but there is also the number of 835 indicated for Carl Ben. Could you remind us what that means?
Yes, thank you. So again, when we looked at the floor plan of Carl Ben Eielson, and we looked at the number of instructional spaces or classroom spaces, we did a walkthrough and indicated using 26 students per classroom, and then basically did the math. That gets you to that number of 836 as the capacity for that building, knowing that Just like in all of the other buildings, when we figure out capacity, we do not incorporate the gym or music rooms and things like that. We're looking at core classroom spaces. Also at Carl Ben Eielson and all of our other facilities, we have ancillary spaces for small group instruction. That is not part of that calculation either. But that's how we got to that 836.
Okay, thank you. Rupak.
And just to provide some more context, this conversation, at least since I started in my role, has gone from boundaries to the fourth middle school that was proposed, and now we're back at boundaries. And through that change and back, that's shifted the conversation around capacity and target enrollment as well. So capacity originally calculated, number we gave RSP based off of standardized square foot per student models, was there prior to 2017. This is even before I got there. And then in 2017, Dr. Gross and Dr. Agri at the time walked all of our buildings and then determined capacity based on what he said, based on usage of specialized space, ancillary space. That was given to RSP, and that was used for reports. Then when we started talking about having that fourth middle school, that was predicated on this philosophy of having 4 middle schools in a long-term vision for Fargo High School, Fargo Public Schools, paired with 4 middle schools paired with 4 high schools. In that conversation, we hadn't determined if Discovery would be paired with Davies. That wasn't, I think the vision was Discovery would be paired with a 4th high school down the road, and then the new middle school was going to be paired with Davies. So when we prepared that conversation, we created these numbers called target enrollment, which was based on the capacity of the higher of the 2 pairs. So if a high school has 3 grade levels and you take their capacity, add 1 more grade level, that should be the target enrollment for that middle school as well. So part of this conversation, I know it's really nuanced, is going to be, as we talk about these boundaries, and if you talk about a true feeder pattern, is that to have the vision that Discovery will always be paired with Davies? If so, that could impact those target enrollment numbers as well.
Thank you, Rupak. Okay, just moving on here, just so that we make sure we cover this, and anyone that's watching hears the conversation, knows that we've covered through this. Again, our middle schools are grades 6 through 8. Our high schools are grades 9 through 12. Number 5, the preference is to minimize as much as possible the travel and distance to and from school for all students in each attendance boundary area. That's maybe a sticking point, something that stands out regarding our plans or that might be developed. Number 6, consider the need for space to accommodate all ancillary programs. So the plans that are presented to us, at least in front of us, do all of those plans include the necessary space for ancillary programs in the middle and the high schools?
Yes.
Okay. And then number 7, the preference is to have a middle school to high school attendance boundary feeder system, which is Rupak, some of what Rupak talked about. And that, again, I think could be a sticking point. So number 5 and number 7 kind of stand out in my mind. Does that make sense? Okay, guidelines for setting school attendance boundaries. Provide quality education for all students. Provide equitable, not necessarily equal, space, resources, staffing, and educational opportunities in all district schools. Now, what I see regarding the words here, these words I see meaning we can't create a plan that doesn't do what this says. That administration can't come to us, or, we can make suggestions, right? But that we need to analyze, do these plans in front of us or do any other plans that might come to us violate this? That's extremely important. David?
I wasn't part of any of the task forces that met, and it was so long ago that I probably wouldn't matter. I wouldn't remember them anyway. I'm wondering, how did these guiding principles evolve? The task force didn't put these together.
No, the guiding principles have been part of our plan for many, many years, long-range facility plan since, and this is updated September 2019, but quite some time prior to that. In fact, here it talks about the original set of guiding principles was developed in 2001. during previous long-range facility plan and strategic planning processes engaged by the district.
Okay,
So-
I have a tendency to try to simplify things so that my mind can understand them. But these plans are all basically revolve around number 3, which sets the size of the middle school at no more than 1,000 and the high school at no more than 1,350. I guess my question is, when and how did we come up with those numbers? Now, before I was married, I had this little teeny sports car and I was happy as all get out. But every year I got more kids, I went from a Malibu station wagon up to a van. I'm wondering why our growth is in the south end of the town, of the city. Why has it never been considered that we simply build on to both Davies and Discovery, because they're both designed to be built onto? That was told, we were told that at the time that those two buildings were first put into place. I don't know why who came up with the fact that we can't have more than 1,000 kids in a middle school. I taught at West Fargo in a middle school that was designed for 1,250. We ran that up to 1,600, and guess what? It still worked. So I'm confused. If we were to build on another additional capacity of 500 onto the middle school and the high school, and we put 500 more kids in there, why that wouldn't work?
Dr. Gandhi?
And I think some of these numbers were changed last year when the board changed direction to move towards the 4th high school as well. So I would have to go back, but I do believe that we changed the numbers based on the pairing, because at that point we were directed to move towards creating that 4th high school. So I think, and Marie has her hand up too, so we'll reference that. And then the other piece I'll say is that the original capacity, when we go back to how we looked at capacity based on square footage, originally Fargo South was then built for 1,600. So if it's just, and I think the direction that we were given from the board last year is that we don't want a high school that large. But if that's changed for Far South Fargo, I would just tell the board to explore that this school also has that same capacity to grow larger. So then that's, would you add on or would you build, just throwing everything out there.
And that discussion regarding, yeah, Anne-Marie, in 1 second here, that discussion regarding the size of, or how many students to have in Fargo South, which is where we are here now tonight, we've had that discussion, I know, for many years. I recall that on the board, and really landing on that, although the building could accommodate that many, it's maybe not ideal to have that many students in the building. So Dr. Gross, if you have anything to share, and also Anne-Marie, maybe you have some documentation.
So I just would like to add on to that. I think the conversation has been around how do we have, in our current number of buildings, 3 similar sized high schools. And we've always attempted, if there is a boundary change, to have 3 similar sized high schools, 3 similar sized middle schools. The difficulty with that is just the footprint of Carl Ben Eielson is not as large as Ben Franklin or Discovery Middle School. So if you continue with a true feeder system where Carl Ben Eielson is the only feeder to Fargo South High School, you cannot use the full capacity of this building in a true feeder system because of the size of Carl Ben. So that's why, if there were other conversations to look at some of these guiding principles and no longer have a true feeder system from middle school to high school and the potential to do a split campus, there would be other options. But when the task force came together, it was how do we create scenarios that would have a middle school to high school feeder system.
So it sounds like what you're saying is potentially following a true feeder system could give us some challenges, because we have some building, like this building, that's designed for more students, but we know that many can't go into Carl Ben, for example.
We have the biggest, this building is our largest high school footprint-wise. Carl Ben Eielson is the smallest middle school footprint-wise.
It's kind of the perfect storm. Anne-Marie?
Just wanted to go back to what you guys were wondering about as well with your guiding principles. They were updated in 2019 with the approval of this long-range facility plan. It added number 7 on what you're looking at there, the preference is to have a middle school to high school attendance boundary feeder system. That did not exist until this approval, the approval of, in September 2019 of this plan. Additionally, like Dr. Gandhi indicated, number 3 was updated, and number 3 previously had middle school grades 6 to 8 at 900 to 1,000, and in high school grades 9 to 12, 1,200 to 1,350. And just to remind you, those things were updated per past board conversations. That's why those things were updated. And to the question of if the board has considered adding on to the south side buildings, those have been discussions in the past, and in the past there's a decision not to do that just because of, again, facility size and those ideal numbers you're looking for. Thank you, Emery. Jennifer?
So when those changes, I think you bring up a really good point, David, and I'm wondering, when those changes were made, are these based on data that shows, because to David's point, West Fargo as well as Minnesota have much larger schools. So I know it's important in terms of in our discussions we've had also data provided to us around number of students in a classroom, but not buildings. So why have we always sort of been set in the past or married to these numbers in terms of size of the collective as the whole building?
Rupak?
So my understanding is that these numbers were based off of, so this long-range facilities plan in front of you, if you looked at page 12, was designed when we thought that we were going to go through the concept of building a new middle school. And that would go off of the four middle schools and 4 high school concept. So these numbers, I believe, were based off of, and I think Dr. Grosso has that PowerPoint, of taking a look at our capacity of what each of those buildings would be. So it's not even just a matter of where we wanted our buildings to be. It's if we had that true feeder pattern in on number 7, then there's only a range that we could have been in.
So I guess I understand that. To clarify, what my question really is what data supports keeping our middle schools at this level versus increasing them if there really is square footage to do so? And then, so I'm really looking for where in the research does it say this is the optimal size of a building? If there isn't any, then that's the answer. But that I'm curious about. And the same question would be related to split, because we split our elementaries. So why is there, again, literature to support recommending this as something that stays?
Dr. Gross? Were you wanting to speak, Dr. Gross?
Certainly. I don't know if we can point to literature that would say there is a ideal size for our community, but what we've looked at a lot around is what is too small when it comes to some of our high schools, to make sure that we can offer the course offerings that come back to number 1, the first bullet under the guidelines for setting attendance boundaries, that we want equitable educational opportunities to ensure that students, no matter which high school they attend, can have access to a similar set of courses and classes. Now, we know each and every year that could vary based upon student interest, because we are driven by what the students ask to take, and sometimes we may not have a course in one of our high schools just based upon the number of requests, but we each and every year continue to ask, and when there is that critical number, we certainly offer that course. We also then offer a shuttle in between our schools, at least at the high school, so that if a student really still wanted to take a course or class, they could take that shuttle to a different high school and take that. So we really strive and stress the opportunity for those equitable educational opportunities. So much of our conversation has been around, if we get too small, do we hinder that part of the conversation?
And I would just add on, and I would say I wholeheartedly agree. I think the only concern in terms of the numbers for me would be not being too small to the point where we can't offer certain programming at one school. I come from Texas. I was a principal of a school that was 3,000 kids. I think there's operationally and experience-wise, it could be very different, right? If you want to promote certain amount of class sizes and a culture that you want, there's those factors, but that's not that it can't be discussed. And then going back to number 7, yeah, we do have elementary schools that are split. You could have middle schools that are split as well. This was something that was asked of the task force, and then the board had asked that we do have a middle school to high school feeder system. But again, that could also change what's proposed or what the board decides to do if the board decides that no longer philosophy exists. And I think what I would just say is, if we keep changing the guiding principles one year after the other, that's fine, but what's the action that we're going to get to? Because then we could split, potentially 8th graders from Discovery could be going some to South and some to Davies if you no longer wanted to honor a feeder system.
Anyone else have comments? We're going to need to figure out something that is a little bit conclusive at the end of this meeting. And what time is it? Is it 8:20, 8:35 maybe? How are we going to be moving forward? Jim?
Well, and I'm not going to ask Bob to do it now, but I'm going to actually connect with Bob when he's in his office, because I actually want to see a couple of different designs, a little different than 9 or 9.17, but it isn't worth our time for me to do that digging tonight. But I'll connect with Bob.
Okay, Jim, thank you. Anne Marie?
I will remind board members too, all of the scenarios that went through that task force are still available online too. So there is possibilities that perhaps what you wish to see were reviewed by the task force. Now, the data that would be available online is no longer up to date as far as the numbers, like Bob has shown with the updates that have occurred for you tonight. But I just want to remind you that that all is still available publicly.
Thank you, Anne Marie. Rupak? Or Bob? Dr. Gross?
Thank you very much for that reminder. So if you go to our district website, to the About Us section, there is on the left-hand side, there's a link to Task Forces 2019. That'll bring you to a page, and on that page, one of them hyperlinked is the Building Capacity and Usage Task Force, and you can go to each of the agendas and all of the corresponding information. On the screen just happens to be some of those other scenarios that were reviewed. And under this packet, I believe here were the first 10 or 12. The next evening are the next 15, and so on. So you're absolutely right. Some of those scenarios may be online. They, again, will refer back to data in 2019 where the students were located, and we could certainly update those if that is the wishes of the board.
Thank you, Dr. Gross. Jim?
I was just sharing with Rebecca that if any board members, as you look at these maps, and especially for the new board members, this is a whole lot to digest this evening. If you start looking at these and you go, boy, I wonder if we did this to the map, what it would look like. If you could get those suggestions, whatever you'd like to look at, to me in the next week or two at our first planning meeting, which will probably be the first or second week in September, I'll sit down with Bob beforehand and try to build these same maps for whatever a board member wanted to look at. So then when we get back together, second meeting in September or whatever, we're going to address this again. If there are specific, you know, whether it's a true feeder system or I'm going to be playing around with that Prairiewood neighborhood, obviously, which is why I asked about it. If you get those to me, I'll just try to get them all to Bob and come back, and we'll look at them at planning and then bring updated maps if there are requests for people to look at. So we might get to scenario, I think we'll go with Z, Y, and U and leave the numbers behind. But anyway, willing to do that at planning.
And it seems like it could fit there. Any other discussion right now? Jennifer? Thank you, Jim, for suggesting that.
Thank you. So, so I think this is, you know, a good discussion that we're talking about, Rebecca, because to your point, there are many things listed here as to, you know, what we strive to consider, but at what point do we decide which one rises to the top and which one moves up or down the list? And so I guess for me, when I look at provide equitable experiences, clearly that needs to be at the top. And so in any of these scenarios, we need to look at that. And I think how and when did we decide that that the numbers or the preference to keep middle and high school attendance, I'm just throwing one out for conversation, that number 7 is more important than consider transportation costs and distances for families? Like, how did we decide, that one was, rose above the rest? I guess I think that we should maybe talk about that.
And I don't think we have decided that. I think they're all kind of almost on the same level in terms of importance right now. Rupak?
I think just for structure to what that could look like, I'm just going to say a process that does exist is that the long-range facilities plan does get renewed and approved by the board every year, and it goes through planning, and then it comes to there. I don't know if that needs to change, but I think that's how last year we changed those guiding principles, and that's why we designed the long-range facilities plan based on what we thought the projects were going to be for the school district. So that is a system that's in place that where the planning committee will review the long-range facilities plan, and then it'll come to the board for approval.
And then a question would be in doing that, if there are any changes that are made here, are the changes that would be presented potentially ranked or not ranked? They're numbered here, right? But they're not in a ranked order. Number 1 is not, just because it's at number 1, that doesn't mean we've said it's more important than number 7. And so I think that's one of the exercises that we almost need to go through. And I think we need to have an honest conversation about striving to balance socioeconomic mix when setting secondary attendance areas. I think we need to talk about what that really is and what that all involves. It's broken out here, and in terms of EL, special ed, free and reduced, and ethnicity. Well, there are, in some of those areas, we might be able to strike some kind of a mix, but probably not in all of them. And I don't think it's because we wouldn't want to. Our city is laid out in a way that provides us with some challenges to achieve that as well. So I think it's important to have, at least that's my own opinion, I think it's important to have that conversation. Because I know that there have been numerous exercises, and that's probably one of the challenges with the task force, is addressing that bullet point and trying to figure out what's the perfect design, in order to achieve a socioeconomic mix. And then what is a socioeconomic mix? What's an acceptable socioeconomic mix? What can we actually achieve here in the Fargo School District on that regard? Because if we can't really achieve something, then, maybe we have to it's not saying don't have it there anymore, but maybe we have to realize that can't be the top priority because it's just too difficult to achieve. So I just would encourage us to have that kind of dialogue. I'm not saying this because I don't think that's important. Honestly, I think it's one of the most important things, but I don't know how effectively we can achieve it.
I'm not opposed to anything you're saying. I know that everyone's tired, but I would say that this is that opportunity for that dialogue. If you're looking at the potentially opportunities to go to planning and then a recommendation to the board, but there might be conversations that could impact how planning makes their decisions, and this would be the time to do that. I mean, we've had this conversation. I know it's a long evening, but at the same point, this is what the work session's for.
I would agree with that because planning would need some guidance too. It's like if the pre-work is done there, and then that information is going to be brought to the full board, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for that committee to do a bunch of work that then, when it comes to the board, we're not going to be supportive of the process that committee went through. Is there any other, Tracy?
I would just be hesitant to attempt to rank these by importance. I think that would be a very difficult thing for all of us to agree on. I just wonder about changing the numbers to bullet points, and they're all equal. I mean, right? When I see a patient in my clinic, I talk to them about, you know, eating 5 fresh fruits and vegetables a day and car seat safety and less than 2 hours of screen time. It doesn't mean any one is more important than the other. They're all important. It doesn't matter the order I say them in. I think that would be kind of a fruitless endeavor.
Point taken. Thank you very much. I'm not saying that it's a fruitless endeavor, but I get what you're saying. Seth?
I also have a question, and I don't know if I'm missing something here or not, but reading these principles, and obviously I totally agree that if bullet pointing them would take the imagery of importance away. But if Dr. Gross is saying that it's very difficult for us to have a true feeder system when we have Carl Bend trying to feed Fargo South, doesn't that put number 5 and number 7 a little bit at odds with each other?
Yes.
Remedy that, I guess. And what do we do about that? If we don't want to rank these, it's kind of hard to say, well, what's more important? Is it more important to have a true feeder system, or is it more important to have our kids travel less distance than they need to be doing just so we can achieve a true feeder system?
Right. Tracy?
Again, I think that it's okay to have them all there, that these are all important to us, and we just try to approve the plan that meets the most of them. There may not be a perfect plan that is going to be able to do that. I know, again, my same analogy, not every family leaves and does all those things. I wish they would, but if they're doing 5 out of 7, I'm happy.
Jennifer?
So I see where you're coming from, Tracy, and why you're, and I appreciate that. My question then, my follow-up question would be, how do you decide what makes the list, right? I mean, because it's usually data-driven, correct? The things that you're asking your patients to do, whether it's fewer than 2 hours of screen time or safety car seats. And so I would then go to say, okay, well, specifically number 7, how did it land here? Did it land here because this is what is best for students, is to keep them, you know, this, it's just one example. You know, I don't mean to keep picking on that one, but the size of the building, that's an easier one because we have neighbors that are different than us. Why is it important to us to keep this number? And so for me, that's what makes it go down, right? Because for me, it's how do these affect the students and their families directly, first and foremost, right? In terms of opportunities and equity across the district, because when you're talking about distance to school and all of, say, 2 of your 3 middle schools, for example, are the same, but then you have an outlier. How did we decide that the rules applied to 2 and not 3? Right? I mean, so they're all on the page. However, are we following them uniformly, and how did they get here?
Dr. Gandhi?
I think, this conversation right now is a challenge that
saying, I think that's why I asked to back up, and let's just start with a fresh pair of eyes. And it may very well be one of these, I don't know, but that would be my suggestion.
And I think we have the opportunity to have that fresh set of eyes, even though we've already said tonight here, a couple of these plans are going to go forward, but all of us can come up with other scenarios if we would like to. Nikki?
And to that point, when we were given these as a task force, and we would challenge Bob, who challenged us back with a smile, and we'd say, well, do we have to go by this? Do we have to follow that? Would the board entertain this? And he would say simply that this is what the board has approved for us to work with. So working with those principles laid out as they were, that is how the task force proceeded. So if there is a change or shift in those principles, or if we decide that something floats more to the top than something else, if we notice in 7 and in 3 as well, there's a preference. It's not a requirement. It's a preference, and maybe we need to look more at that. But we actually had a fair amount of time, and it was very in-depth. We had city planners come in. Dr. Gandhi was there for, I think, every one of them. And so it was vetted at length, and we tried our hardest to meet as many of the guiding principles as we possibly could. And that's why the other plans didn't make it through.
Dr. Gandhi, did you have something to add?
I was just going to say a process thing, and it's no offense to any board members, but we have a whole team down here that's working on COVID instruction along with a virtual academy. So I'm just going to ask Jim, when he works with Jolynn, to schedule the next planning meeting to maybe give Bob set a deadline for board members for your request, maybe like 2 weeks in advance or a week in advance, so we can do this work and be manageable, because last minute requests at this point, we just have other focuses with the school year.
All right. I'm feeling like we could adjourn. What do you think? All right. Is it?
Second.
Okay. All right. I also wanted to mention, I was supposed to mention this at the end of our regular board meeting, but, and I think Anne Marie might have talked about this a little bit, but just with meeting here, how it's really difficult to call in. I know I'm gonna try to call in and get it set up for the next regular board meeting, but that it can't be a last minute, oh my gosh, that's right, I can't be at the meeting, could I call in type of a thing, because that arrangement isn't going to be able to be made because we're not in our regular board meeting. So board members need to communicate if they need to join via phone no later than noon the Monday prior to the board meeting. And I can send this out too, but just wanting to make sure that we pay close attention to that. I'll try to do that as well.
And no, we still have to figure that out. As you can tell, we're doing something very different and something we haven't done before, and so there's a lot of technology involved in doing this, and so we need to make sure we can do that. And then obviously last minute accommodations are just harder to do. There's lots of staff members and staff time that's getting devoted to hosting these meetings differently, and so we just need as much time as possible.
Well, thank you for everything that you have done, Anne Marie and others involved, to allow us to be able to meet here, and so that we can have the public here for that dialogue. And we're done. It's 9 o'clock, I think. Thank you so much for coming.